His mistress called me daily, describing intimate details of their relationship. She'd laugh about how pathetic I was, how easily I was being replaced. For months, I listened to her cruelty in silence. Then I invited her to coffee at the place where she thought she was meeting him. What she found instead changed everything. The phone rang at exactly 7:43 p.m. on a Tuesday evening, the same time it had rung every Tuesday for the past 3 months. I was stirring pasta sauce when I heard that familiar, sickeningly sweet voice on the other end. "Chloe? It's Mila. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." The way she said my name, like it tasted bitter on her tongue, made my stomach clench. But I steadied my breathing, set down the wooden spoon, and prepared myself for another session of calculated torture. "Hello, Mila." My voice came out exactly as I'd practiced. Weary, defeated, with just enough tremor to suggest I was barely holding myself together. "I just had to call and tell you about the most amazing weekend Nolan and I had." He paused, savoring the moment like expensive wine. "We went to that little bed and breakfast in Monterey, you know, the one with the ocean view? He said you two used to go there for anniversaries." Before we continue, if you believe women deserve to reclaim their power and never accept being silenced, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more women who need this. Now let's see how I fought back. My fingers tightened around the phone. Seaside Haven. We'd spent our first anniversary there, our third, our fifth. I remembered the way Nolan used to trace patterns on my back while we listened to the waves crash against the rocks below our window. The memory felt like a physical blow, but I swallowed the pain and let it fuel my resolve. "That sounds lovely," I managed, injecting just enough sadness into my tone to make her feel victorious. "Oh, it was more than lovely. He told me he'd never felt so free, so alive. He said being with you had become like wearing a coat that was 3 sizes too small, suffocating and uncomfortable." Her laugh was sharp, designed to cut. "He even said your cooking had gotten boring. Same 5 meals on rotation," he told me. "Like eating at a nursing home." I glanced at the pasta sauce, his favorite recipe, one I'd perfected over 7 years of marriage. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was preparing dinner for a man who apparently mocked my cooking to his mistress. "I see," I whispered, letting the words hang in the air like a confession of defeat. "You know what the best part was, though?" Mila continued, her voice taking on that particular tone of cruelty that had become her signature. "He said he feels guilty sometimes, but then he remembers how you've let yourself go. She doesn't even try anymore," he said. "When I come home, she's in those awful sweats, hair in a messy bun, looking like she's given up on life." I touched my hair self-consciously. It was indeed in a messy bun, and yes, I was wearing comfortable clothes. But I'd been working from home, managing our household, trying to keep our life together while he was apparently dissecting my appearance with another woman. The silence stretched between us. I could hear her breathing, waiting for me to break, to beg, to give her the dramatic reaction she craved. Instead, I practiced the technique I'd perfected over these months of torture. I let the pause extend just long enough to suggest I was fighting back tears, then delivered my response in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "Is that so? Oh, Chloe." Her voice dripped with false sympathy. "I almost feel sorry for you. Almost. But then I remember that you're living in a fantasy, thinking you still have a marriage worth saving." I walked to the kitchen window, staring out at the garden where Nolan and I had once planned to build a swing set for the children we'd dreamed of having. The wooden stakes were still there, marking the corners where we'd measured and discussed and hoped. Now they looked like tiny gravestones in the fading light. "Last Thursday," Mila continued, "we went to that new restaurant downtown, Bella Vista? The one with the private booths? He said he'd been wanting to take you there for your birthday, but then he realized he'd rather share new experiences with someone who actually appreciates them." My birthday. 3 weeks ago. He'd taken me to our usual chain restaurant, claimed he'd forgotten to make reservations anywhere special. I'd pretended not to mind, had even smiled and thanked him for the generic card he'd obviously picked up last minute from the gas station. "He's so thoughtful," I said, my voice breaking just slightly on the last word. It wasn't entirely acting. The betrayal still stung even though I'd known about it for months. "He really is. And the gifts, Chloe. The jewelry, the lingerie, the weekend getaways. He told me he'd stopped buying you things because you never seemed to appreciate them. She'd rather have practical gifts," he said. "Vacuum cleaners and coffee makers. No romance left in her." I remembered the last gift he'd given me, a new set of kitchen knives for Christmas. I'd thanked him, used them to prepare meals he apparently complained about to his mistress. The cosmic joke of it all was almost funny in a twisted way. "He sounds very generous," I replied, adding a slight sniff to suggest I was crying. "Oh, he is. Last week he surprised me with a weekend in Napa Valley. We stayed at this incredible resort, the kind of place where they bring champagne to your room and draw baths with rose petals. He said he'd never done anything like that for anyone before. Mila makes me want to be romantic again," he told me. "She brings out the man I used to be." I closed my eyes, remembering our 10th anniversary just 6 months ago. He'd taken me to dinner at a chain restaurant and given me a gift card to Target. I'd convinced myself that practical love was more mature, more stable than grand gestures. "That's wonderful for you both," I said, my voice hollow. "You know what I think, Chloe?" Mila's tone shifted, becoming more direct, more vicious. "I think you're holding on to something that's already dead. He doesn't love you anymore. He doesn't want you. He's just too much of a coward to file for divorce himself." The words hit their mark, but not in the way she intended. Instead of crushing me, they crystallized something I'd been feeling for months. A strange sense of power that came from knowing something she didn't. "Maybe you're right," I said, letting my voice crack with what she would interpret as defeat. "I know I'm right. And honestly, I'm doing you a favor by calling. Someone needs to wake you up from this pathetic delusion that you still have a husband." I heard Nolan's car in the driveway, the familiar sound of his engine shutting off, his footsteps on the front porch. He'd be walking through that door any moment, expecting dinner and normalcy, having no idea that his mistress had just spent 20 minutes describing their intimate moments to his wife. "I should go," I said softly. "He's home." Of course he is. Back to his boring, predictable life with his boring, predictable wife. Mila's laugh was sharp and triumphant. "Enjoy your evening, Chloe. I know I'll enjoy mine thinking about how pathetic this all is." The line went dead just as Nolan walked through the front door. He looked tired, slightly guilty, but he smiled when he saw me. "Something smells amazing," he said, hanging his coat in the closet. "What are you making?" "Your favorite pasta," I replied, turning back to the stove. "How was your meeting?" "Long, boring. You know how it is." He came up behind me, placed his hands on my shoulders. "I'm sorry I've been working so much lately. I know it's hard on you." I leaned back against him, feeling the weight of his hands, the warmth of his body. 3 months ago, this moment would have filled me with love and forgiveness. Now it felt like a performance we were both giving, though only I knew we had an audience. "It's okay," I said. "I understand." What I didn't tell him was that I understood far more than he realized. I understood that while he was apologizing for working late, his mistress was probably getting ready for bed, replaying our conversation and feeling victorious. I understood that his guilt was making him kinder to me, more attentive, which only made Mila's cruelty more potent. But most importantly, I understood something that neither of them knew yet. Something that would change everything. As I served dinner, I thought about the 3 pregnancy tests hidden in my dresser drawer, all showing the same result. 43 days along according to my calculations. A secret that would shift the balance of power in ways that Mila, with all her cruel phone calls and detailed descriptions of their affair, could never imagine. I watched Nolan eat the pasta he'd apparently called boring, compliment the sauce he'd mocked to another woman, and I smiled. Not the defeated smile of a broken wife, but the quiet smile of someone who knew that the game was about to change completely. The phone would ring again on Thursday morning, right after he left for his business meeting. Mila would call with more stories, more cruelty, more attempts to break me down. And I would listen, respond with my practiced weakness, and let her believe she was winning. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let your enemy think they've already won, while you prepare to show them exactly how wrong they are. That night, as Nolan slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and let my mind drift back to the darkest chapter of our marriage, one he believed was buried and forgotten. It had been 8 months ago when I'd first seen those 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test. The joy that flooded through me was so pure, so overwhelming that I'd actually laughed out loud in our bathroom. We'd been trying for over a year and finally it was happening. I'd planned the perfect way to tell him. A small gift box with tiny baby shoes inside, placed on his pillow while he was in the shower. I could still remember the look on his face when he opened it. Not joy, not excitement, but something that looked almost like panic. Are you sure? He'd asked, his voice strangely flat. 3 tests, I'd said, beaming. All positive. We're going to be parents, Nolan. He'd hugged me then, said all the right words, but something in his embrace felt wrong. Too tight, too desperate, like he was trying to squeeze the life out of something. The weeks that followed were a blur of strange behavior I'd attributed to normal expectant father nerves. He'd become obsessively attentive about my evening routine, insisting on making my chamomile tea himself every night. You're growing a baby, he'd say with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Let me take care of you. The tea tasted different somehow, more bitter with an earthy undertone I couldn't place. When I mentioned it, he'd laugh and say he was trying a new brand, something organic and supposedly better for pregnant women. I'd drink it gratefully, touched by his thoughtfulness. The cramping started on a Tuesday morning, sharp and low in my abdomen. By evening there was blood. By Thursday it was over. These things happen, the emergency room doctor had said gently. First trimester losses are more common than people realize. There's nothing you could have done differently. I'd grieved deeply, blamed myself for weeks. Nolan had been supportive in all the right ways, bringing me flowers, holding me while I cried, suggesting we wait a few months before trying again. His relief, which he thought he was hiding, felt like salt in an open wound. The follow-up appointment 3 weeks later was routine. Blood work, physical exam, the doctor checking to make sure everything was healing properly. I almost didn't go. What was the point of examining the aftermath of failure? Dr. Martinez had frowned at my blood results, then frowned deeper. Chloe, I'm seeing some unusual markers in your system. Have you been taking any herbal supplements? Anything not prescribed? No, I'd said, confused. Just prenatal vitamins and the calcium tablets you recommended. She'd pulled out a reference chart, her expression growing more concerned. I'm seeing traces of blue cohosh and pennyroyal. These are herbs that can cause uterine contractions. They're sometimes used to induce labor or other things. The bottom dropped out of my world. Other things. In high enough concentrations they can cause miscarriage. They're dangerous, especially in the first trimester. She'd looked at me carefully. You're certain you haven't taken anything containing these herbs? I'd driven home in a daze, her words echoing in my mind. When I'd gotten to our kitchen, I'd torn through every cabinet, every drawer, looking for something I hoped I wouldn't find. Behind Nolan's vitamin bottles, pushed far back where I'd never think to look, I discovered a small brown bottle labeled Evening Blend Women's Wellness Tea. The ingredient list read like a catalog of everything Dr. Martinez had found in my blood. Blue cohosh, pennyroyal, black cohosh, and other herbs I'd never heard of. I'd stood there holding that bottle, my hands shaking, while the truth crashed over me like a physical blow. My husband, the man who'd held me while I cried over our lost baby, had been the one who'd killed it. The rage that filled me was so pure, so white-hot, that for a moment I couldn't breathe. I'd wanted to confront him immediately, to scream and throw things and demand answers. Instead, I'd carefully placed the bottle back where I'd found it and made a decision that would change everything. I would never tell him I knew. Over the following months, I'd watched him with new eyes. The way he'd suggest we wait longer before trying again. How he'd carefully monitor my cycle, becoming anxious around ovulation. The relief in his posture when my period would arrive each month. His mother had started dropping hints about grandchildren during family dinners, and I'd watched Nolan deflect with practiced ease. We're not ready yet, he'd say. Maybe next year. But his eyes would find mine across the table and I'd see the warning there. Don't you dare contradict me. The most sickening part was how considerate he'd become afterward. Flowers for no reason, surprise dinners out, weekend getaways to bed and breakfasts. I'd thought he was trying to help me heal from our loss. Now I realized he was celebrating. During one of those weekends, to a place called Seaside Haven, ironically the same place Mila had mentioned on the phone, he'd been particularly affectionate. We'd walked along the beach at sunset and he'd pulled me close. I love our life just the way it is, he'd said, kissing my temple. Sometimes I think we're perfect as we are, you know? Just us. I'd smiled and agreed even as my stomach churned. Just us. No complications, no children to complicate his perfectly controlled world. But Nolan had underestimated his own father, a man who'd seen through his son's selfishness long before I had. The conversation had happened during our last Christmas together, just 3 months before the miscarriage. Nolan's father, William, had pulled me aside while Nolan was outside helping his mother with something. "Chloe," he'd said, his weathered hands gentle on my shoulders. "I want you to know something important. When you give this family its first grandchild, and you will, everything will shift in your favor." At the time, I'd thought it was just a sweet comment from a man who desperately wanted grandchildren. William had always been kinder to me than his wife, more accepting, more genuinely warm. He'd treat me like the daughter he'd never had, while his actual son treated me like an inconvenience. "That's very sweet, William," I'd said. "I hope we can give you grandchildren soon." His eyes had grown serious. "I'm not being sweet, dear. I'm being practical. I've made sure of it." I hadn't understood what he meant then. After he'd passed away suddenly from a heart attack 6 weeks later, the comment had faded into the background of grief and funeral arrangements. It wasn't until 6 months after his death, when the lawyer had finally sorted through the estate documents, that the full picture emerged. The will had been revised just 2 months before his death, and buried in the legal language was a clause that made my blood run cold. Upon the birth of William Foster's first biological grandchild, the document read, "The following assets shall be transferred into an irrevocable trust for said child. The rental property at 847 Maple Street, portfolio account number 4471 with Meridian Investments, and a 40% ownership stake in Foster & Sons Hardware." The trust would be managed by the child's primary legal guardian, a role that, by law and by William's specific designation, would fall to me as the mother, not to Nolan as the father. I'd read that clause over and over, my hands trembling. The rental property alone was worth over $300,000. The investment portfolio had grown to nearly $180,000. And Foster & Sons Hardware, while small, was profitable and provided steady income. Suddenly, Nolan's desperate opposition to having children made perfect sense. It wasn't about not wanting to be a father. It was about not wanting to lose control of money he considered his inheritance. The bitter irony was devastating. His father had seen his son's true nature and had crafted the perfect insurance policy. William had known that any grandchild of his would need protection from Nolan's selfishness, so he'd created a financial safety net that would activate the moment that child was born. Nolan knew about this clause. He'd been present when the will was read, had seen the lawyer explain the terms. His face had remained carefully neutral, but I'd noticed how his jaw had tightened, how his hands had clenched in his lap. No wonder he'd been so desperate to prevent my pregnancy. No wonder he'd resorted to herbs and manipulation instead of just having an honest conversation about not wanting children. A conversation would have required him to admit he was prioritizing money over my dreams of motherhood. Now, lying in the darkness beside him, I placed my hand on my still flat stomach where a new life was growing. 43 days along, and this time I was the only one who knew. This pregnancy wasn't just about the baby I'd longed for. It was about justice. It was about a wise old man's foresight and a father's love protecting his future grandchild from his own son's greed. Nolan shifted beside me, murmuring something in his sleep. Probably dreaming about Mila, about his carefully constructed double life where he got to play the romantic leading man while keeping his boring wife safely contained and childless at home. He had no idea that his world was about to change forever. That his father's final gift was growing inside me, bringing with it not just new life, but a complete redistribution of power. The man who'd poisoned his own wife to prevent losing money was about to discover that some things were more powerful than his control, more permanent than his schemes. And I was going to enjoy every moment of his realization. 3 weeks passed before I made my move. 3 weeks of Mila's regular calls, each one more vicious than the last, each one adding another layer to my growing plan. She'd grown bolder, more detailed in her descriptions, clearly feeding off what she perceived as my increasing weakness. But I wasn't getting weaker. I was getting ready. The pregnancy symptoms had started in earnest. Morning queasiness that I hid from Nolan by claiming I had a stomach bug, exhaustion that I blamed on work stress. Every secret symptom felt like armor I was putting on, piece by piece preparing for battle. I spent hours researching the perfect location for our confrontation. It had to be public enough that she couldn't cause a scene, intimate enough for a private conversation, and symbolic enough to give me the psychological advantage I needed. Murphy's Diner sat on the corner of 5th and Main, its red vinyl booths and checkered floors unchanged since the 1950s. Nolan and I had discovered it during our second year of marriage, when we'd been apartment hunting in that neighborhood. Every Sunday morning for 3 years we'd shared coffee and pancakes there, planning our future over bottomless cups and warm syrup. I told him once that Murphy's felt like the place where we'd fallen deepest in love, where all our dreams had taken shape. He'd laughed and kissed powdered sugar off my lips, promising we'd bring our children there someday for birthday breakfasts and celebration dinners. The irony of choosing that location wasn't lost on me. In a place where I'd once planned a future with him, I was about to destroy the future he'd built without me. I arrived at 1:30, 30 minutes before the meeting I'd arranged. The lunch crowd was thinning out, leaving mostly empty booths and the low murmur of afternoon coffee drinkers. I chose the corner booth where Nolan and I used to sit, positioning myself with a clear view of the entrance and my back to the wall. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes and sensible shoes, approached with a coffee pot. "Just coffee today, honey?" "Yes, please. I'm waiting for someone." I wrapped my hands around the warm mug, using its heat to steady my nerves. At exactly 1:45, I pulled out the burner phone I'd purchased with cash the week before. The app I'd downloaded let me send texts from any number, and I'd already programmed in Nolan's contact information. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I crafted the message that would bring Mila running. "Can't wait to see you. Murphy's at 2. Need to talk about us." And I'd studied Nolan's texting patterns for months, noting his tendency toward brief messages, his habit of signing texts with his initial when he was being romantic. I'd even referenced their dinner at Bella Vista from the week before, adding just enough specificity to make the message believable. Her response came back within seconds. "Finally. I've been hoping you'd say that. See you soon." The heart emoji made my stomach turn, but it also confirmed what I'd suspected. She thought this meeting was going to be significant. Maybe she was expecting him to finally leave me or propose, or make some grand declaration. Whatever she was expecting, it definitely wasn't me. I ordered a slice of apple pie I had no intention of eating, just to give myself something to do with my hands while I waited. The clock on the wall ticked toward 2 o'clock with agonizing slowness. At 2:03 the diner door chimed and she walked in. Mila moved like someone who owned every room she entered, her heels clicking confidently against the checkered floor. She wore the red dress she'd described to me in excruciating detail during one of her calls. The one Nolan had supposedly said brought out the color in her eyes, the one she'd worn to their dinner at that expensive steakhouse downtown. Her dark hair was styled in perfect waves, her makeup flawless despite the afternoon heat. She'd clearly put effort into looking stunning for what she thought would be a romantic meeting with my husband. Her eyes swept the diner, searching for Nolan's familiar figure. I watched her face change as she processed the mostly empty restaurant, the absence of the man she'd come to meet. Her gaze landed on me last and I saw the exact moment recognition dawned. Confusion flickered first. Why was the pathetic wife sitting in the restaurant where she was supposed to meet her lover? Then came anger, sharp and immediate as she realized she'd been deceived. Finally, that familiar smirk of superiority settled over her features, the same expression I'd learned to hate during our phone conversations. "Wow." Her voice carried clearly across the quiet diner, causing several customers to look up from their meals. "This must be rock bottom for you, Chloe. Did you really think ambushing me would change anything?" She clutched her designer purse like a weapon, her whole body radiating the kind of confidence that comes from believing you're untouchable. Other diners were starting to stare, but their attention didn't seem to bother her. If anything, she seemed to enjoy having an audience for my humiliation. I took a slow sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unsettle her. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, almost conversational. "Sit down, Mila. Please." "I don't think so." She turned to leave, her heels already clicking toward the door. "Whatever pathetic plea you've prepared, I'm not interested in hearing it. I'm not here to fight." The words stopped her mid-stride. "I just thought you should know something important." She turned back, one perfectly shaped eyebrow raised in skeptical amusement. "What could you possibly tell me that I don't already know?" I gestured to the empty seat across from me. "Sit. Just for a minute." Something in my tone must have intrigued her because she hesitated. Maybe it was the lack of desperation in my voice, or the fact that I wasn't crying or begging like she'd expected. After a moment she slid into the booth across from me, but perched on the edge like she might bolt at any second. You have 2 minutes, she said, checking her watch with theatrical impatience. Then I'm leaving and I'm calling Nolan to tell him about your little stunt. I studied her face, memorizing the smugness in her expression, the certainty that she held all the power in this situation. In a few seconds that certainty would shatter completely. I'm pregnant, I said simply. The words hung in the air between us. I watched her process them, saw the moment when their significance hit her. Her confident smile faltered just slightly. Congratulations, she said finally, but her voice had lost some of its edge. I'm sure Nolan is thrilled. 43 days along. I continued as if she hadn't spoken. And this time he can't stop it. That got her attention. Her eyes sharpened, focusing on me with new intensity. What do you mean, this time? I didn't answer directly. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out the folded copy of William's will that I'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for exactly this moment. The paper was slightly worn from handling, but the legal language was still crisp and clear. I placed it on the table between us, right next to the untouched slice of apple pie, and slid it toward her. You don't have to believe me about the pregnancy, Mila. But he will. I tapped the document with one finger. And when you ask him about this, you'll understand exactly why. Her laughter was sharp and too loud for the quiet diner, causing the elderly couple 2 booths over to frown in our direction. You really think a baby is going to make him choose you? That's adorable. She leaned back in the booth, her confidence returning as she dismissed my revelation. He's already told me about your desperate attempts to trap him with a pregnancy. It's honestly pathetic how predictable you are. Read it, I said quietly. I don't need to read anything. You're delusional if you think. Read it. My voice carried a note of authority that surprised us both. Trust me, you'll want to understand what you're really dealing with. Something in my tone must have penetrated her arrogance because she picked up the paper. I watched her eyes scan the legal language, saw the exact moment when she reached the crucial clause about the trust fund. Her face went through a series of expressions, confusion, disbelief, and finally, a dawning understanding that drained the color from her cheeks. I stood up, placing exact change for my coffee on the table. The pie remained untouched. I'd lost my appetite weeks ago and today was no exception. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon, Mila, I said, my voice perfectly pleasant. I'm sure you and Nolan will have a very interesting conversation. I walked toward the exit without looking back, but I could feel her eyes burning into my back. The door chimed as I stepped out into the afternoon sunshine, and I couldn't resist glancing through the large front window. Mila was hunched over the document, her perfect posture completely forgotten. She was reading it again, her phone pressed to her ear, probably calling Nolan, demanding explanations for things she'd never thought to question before. Her confident smile was gone, replaced by the kind of frown that comes with realizing you've been playing a game where someone else knew all the rules. I drove home slowly, savoring the image of her bent over that piece of paper, finally understanding that the pathetic wife she'd been tormenting for months had just shown her exactly who held the real power. I didn't have to wait long to see the ripple effects of my revelation. That evening, as I sat in my garden watering the tomato plants I'd been nurturing all summer, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is Mila. We need to talk. Call me. I deleted the message without responding. She'd had her chance to talk at Murphy's diner. Now she could experience the same helplessness I'd felt during those months of cruel phone calls, reaching out to someone who had no interest in answering. 20 minutes later, another text. I know you're getting these. Answer your phone. Then another. We both know you're not as innocent as you pretend to be. I turned my phone face down and continued watering my plants. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was nurturing life while her world was probably falling apart somewhere across town. My neighbor, Mrs. Chin, looked over the fence with concern. Everything all right, dear? You seem distracted. Just enjoying the quiet, I said, which was true. For the first time in months, my phone wasn't ringing with scheduled cruelty. The real fireworks began the next day. I was having lunch with my sister Rachel when Nolan called, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. Chloe, we need to talk. Can you come home? Now. I'm having lunch with Rachel. What's wrong? Just, please, come home. The desperation in his voice was something I'd never heard before, not even during our worst fights. Rachel raised an eyebrow as I gathered my purse. Trouble in paradise? Something like that. I kissed her cheek goodbye. I'll call you later. The drive home felt like traveling toward a storm I'd been watching build on the horizon for months. I found Nolan pacing in our living room like a caged animal, his hair disheveled, his shirt wrinkled like he'd been tugging at it. She knows, he said without preamble. Mila knows about the pregnancy. I see. I settled into my favorite armchair, the one by the window where I'd spent so many evenings reading while he claimed to be working late. How did she find out? Did you tell her? His eyes were wild, searching my face for answers. We had coffee yesterday. I kept my voice conversational, almost casual. He stopped pacing. You what? She thought she was meeting you. Murphy's Diner, 2 o'clock. She seemed quite disappointed when I showed up instead. The color drained from his face. Chloe, what did you do? I told her the truth. About the baby. About your father's will. I watched him carefully, noting how his hands trembled slightly. She didn't take it well. Nolan sank onto the couch, his head in his hands. She's been calling me nonstop. Demanding explanations. She found some lawyer, started asking questions about inheritance law. Smart woman. Almost meant it. What did you tell her? What could I tell her? She already knew everything. He looked up at me, and for the first time in our marriage I saw genuine fear in his eyes. She asked me if the pregnancy was real. I couldn't lie to her, not when she was staring at a legal document. The admission hung between us. He'd confirmed my pregnancy to his mistress before even acknowledging it with me. And then, I prompted. She started connecting dots I never wanted her to see. His voice cracked slightly. She asked about your first pregnancy, about why I was so desperate to prevent this one. She's not stupid, Chloe. She figured out what happened before. There was the moment when his carefully constructed narrative began to crumble. She said you told her I'd had desperate attempts to trap you with pregnancy. Is that really how you described our lost baby to her? Nolan's silence was answer enough. She asked me what I meant when I said I'd handle the situation like before. The words came out in a rush, like a confession he couldn't hold back anymore. I didn't realize how it sounded until she repeated it back to me. I imagined the scene. Mila's growing horror as she realized the man she'd been sleeping with had sabotaged his own wife's pregnancy. The man she thought was romantic and passionate was actually calculating and cruel. What else did she say? She called me a monster. He laughed bitterly. Said she'd been mocking the wrong woman all along. That you'd played her like a chess piece while she thought she was the one in control. Pride swelled in my chest, surprising me with its intensity. Even in her anger and disgust, Mila had recognized the truth. I'd outmaneuvered them both. She's done with me, Nolan continued. Blocked my number, returned everything I ever gave her. Her last text. He pulled out his phone, read from the screen with a hollow voice. You made me waste 8 months on a woman who was always 3 steps ahead of both of us. The text was even more cutting than I'd hoped. Mila hadn't just rejected him, she'd made sure he knew exactly why. She'd seen through his manipulation and found it pathetic rather than charming. The worst part, Nolan said, his voice barely above a whisper, is that everyone's going to know. She's already told people at her office, her friends. She's not keeping this quiet. I'd expected this. Mila's pride had been wounded, her intelligence insulted. Of course she'd want people to know she hadn't been the naive other woman. She'd been outsmarted by the wife everyone thought was weak. Over the following days, the social fallout became apparent. Nolan came home each evening looking more defeated, reporting on conversations with mutual friends who'd heard Mila's version of events. Brad asked me if it was true that I'd been messing with your head during the affair, Nolan said one night, staring into his untouched dinner. Sarah's wife heard I'd been manipulative and controlling. The narrative was shifting. Instead of being seen as a man torn between 2 women, Nolan was being viewed as someone who'd been dishonest with both. Mila's version painted him not as a romantic figure but as a manipulator who'd used and deceived everyone around him. Janet from your office called, I mentioned casually. Mila's putting in for a transfer. Apparently she can't stand to be in the same city anymore. His fork clattered against his plate. She's leaving. Phoenix office. Some kind of promotion opportunity. I'd done my research, called Janet myself to confirm the details. She starts next month. The news seemed to devastate him more than anything else. Not only had Mila rejected him, but she was erasing any possibility of reconciliation by putting 2,000 miles between them. She told Janet something interesting, I continued. Said she'd learned an important lesson about not underestimating quiet women. That sometimes the person you think is powerless is actually the one holding all the cards. Nolan's face crumpled. I've lost everything, haven't I? Not everything, I said quietly. You still have choices to make. But we both knew the truth. His carefully constructed double life had collapsed in a matter of days. The woman he'd thought was desperate and pathetic had orchestrated his downfall with surgical precision. And the mistress who'd made him feel powerful and desired now saw him as a cautionary tale about the dangers of underestimating your opponent. Mila's departure was swift and final. No dramatic confrontations, no attempts to win him back. She simply vanished from our lives as efficiently as she'd entered them, leaving behind only the wreckage of Nolan's ego and the grudging respect I felt for a woman who'd been smart enough to recognize when she'd been outplayed. The phone calls stopped completely. The evening torture sessions that had defined my life for months were over, replaced by a silence that felt like victory. I'd won, but more importantly, I'd taught them both a lesson they'd never forget. Sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who lets you think you're winning right up until the moment you realize you've already lost. The weeks following Mila's departure settled into a strange rhythm. Nolan moved through our house like a ghost, appearing at mealtimes with hollow eyes and mechanical politeness. He'd ask about my day, comment on the weather, offer to help with dishes, all while carefully avoiding any mention of the pregnancy that was becoming impossible to hide. I was 12 weeks along now, and the morning sickness had given way to a small but noticeable bump that I no longer bothered to conceal. I'd catch him staring sometimes, his eyes lingering on my changing body with an expression I couldn't quite read. Longing? Regret? Fear? Perhaps all three. On a Thursday evening in late September, exactly 3 weeks after Mila had sent her final devastating text, I was arranging the baby books I'd bought earlier that day when I heard footsteps on our front porch. Not Nolan's usual confident stride, but something hesitant, almost shuffling. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:43 p.m. The same time Mila used to call with her carefully timed cruelty. I opened the door to find my husband standing there like a stranger asking for shelter. He'd lost weight. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his face had taken on the gaunt appearance of someone who'd forgotten how to sleep properly. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled, like he'd been running his hands through it compulsively. Chloe. His voice cracked on my name. Can we talk? I stepped aside without a word, and he entered our home like he was walking into foreign territory. He paused in the entryway, his eyes taking in the small changes I'd made. The pregnancy books on the coffee table, the prenatal vitamin bottle on the kitchen counter, the What to Expect magazine folded open to an article about second trimester nutrition. You look. He stopped himself, seeming to realize that commenting on my appearance might not be wise given recent history. Different. I supplied. Pregnant. Healthy. Each word was deliberately chosen, a reminder of what he'd tried to prevent. Beautiful, he said quietly. You look beautiful. I led him to the living room, settling into my usual chair while he remained standing, fidgeting with his car keys like a nervous teenager. I've been staying at the extended stay off Highway 12, he said without preamble. 3 weeks now. Giving you space, trying to figure out how to fix this. The information surprised me. I'd assumed he was still sleeping in our guest room, maintaining the illusion of normalcy. The fact that he'd been living in a hotel suggested a level of self-awareness I hadn't credited him with. Have you figured it out? I asked. His laugh was hollow, self-deprecating. No. Not even close. He finally sat down, perching on the edge of the couch like he might flee at any moment. But I know I can't keep pretending this isn't happening. The baby, I mean. Our baby. Hi baby, I corrected gently. You made your feelings about children quite clear. He flinched. Chloe, I need you to know how sorry I am. Not just about Mila, but about what I did to you. To our first baby. The words hung in the air between us. This was the first time he'd acknowledged his role in my miscarriage directly, without euphemisms or deflection. I was selfish. Controlling. I thought I could manage everything, keep everything exactly the way I wanted it. Tears were streaming down his face now, and I was surprised to find that they affected me more than I'd expected. I didn't realize what I was destroying until it was too late. What changed? I asked. 3 weeks ago you were still lying to both of us. What's different now? He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, a gesture so vulnerable it was almost painful to watch. Losing Mila wasn't what broke me. It was realizing she was right, that you'd been 3 steps ahead of me the entire time. That while I thought I was so clever keeping secrets and managing situations, you knew everything. Not everything, I said honestly. I didn't know about the herbs until much later. His face crumpled. How did you find out? I told him about Dr. Martinez, about finding the bottle in our kitchen, about the months of silence that followed. I watched him absorb each detail, saw the moment when he truly understood the depth of what he'd done. You've known for months, he whispered. All this time you knew what I did and you never said anything. What would you have wanted me to say? I don't know. Scream at me. Hit me. Something other than this. He gestured vaguely at my calm demeanor. How can you just sit there and talk about it like we're discussing the weather? Because screaming wouldn't bring our baby back, I said simply. And it wouldn't protect this one. He was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of my words. Is that what all this was about? The coffee with Mila, showing her the will, was it all about protecting this pregnancy? Partly. I placed my hand on my small bump, a gesture that drew his eyes immediately. But it was also about taking back control of my own life. I want to be part of it, he said suddenly. This pregnancy, the baby's life. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking anyway. The request didn't surprise me. I'd been expecting it since the moment Mila left. But the timing felt significant. He was asking on a Thursday evening at the exact time his mistress used to call to torment me. Whether intentional or not, it felt like he was trying to reclaim that hour, to fill it with something better than the cruelty it had once held. I have a doctor's appointment next Tuesday, I said carefully. 16-week checkup. We might be able to learn the gender. Hope flickered in his eyes. Would you let me come with you? I studied his face, noting the way he held his breath while waiting for my answer. Why should I? Because I want to be better. I want to be the father this baby deserves, the husband you deserved all along. The words came out in a rush, like he'd been rehearsing them. I know I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can do better going forward. What does better look like to you? I asked. He seemed unprepared for the question. Honesty. No more secrets. No more trying to control everything. And if the baby changes our financial situation? If the trust activates and I become the manager of assets you consider yours? His jaw tightened. A flash of the old Nolan, the one who viewed everything in terms of control and ownership. But then he forced his expression to relax. Then we figure it out together. As partners. Partners, I repeated. Is that what we were when you were slipping herbs into my tea? No. The word came out flat, defeated. We weren't partners. I was a manipulator and you were someone I was trying to control instead of love. The admission was more honest than anything he'd said in years of marriage. It also highlighted exactly why I couldn't simply forgive and forget. I'll think about the appointment, I said finally. Relief washed over his features. Thank you. That's more than I deserve. Yes, I agreed. It is. Over the following days, Nolan began what could only be described as a campaign to prove his worthiness. He brought groceries without being asked, left prenatal vitamins on my nightstand, researched the best pediatricians in our area. When I mentioned that I'd signed up for a birthing class, he asked, tentatively, if I'd consider letting him attend. But for every gesture of consideration, I felt the weight of everything that had come before. The herbs hidden behind his vitamins. The months of phone calls while he said nothing. The way he described me to his mistress as boring, demanding, desperate. Some wounds were too deep for grand gestures to heal. Some trust, once broken, couldn't be rebuilt with good intentions and prenatal vitamins. Still, I found myself softening in small ways. When he asked about the birthing class, I told him I'd consider it. When he offered to help set up the nursery, I didn't immediately refuse. Not because I was ready to forgive him, but because I was beginning to understand the difference between forgiveness and reconciliation. I could forgive him for my own peace of mind. But trusting him with my heart again? That was a different conversation entirely. That conversation about forgiveness versus trust became the foundation for everything that followed. Over the next few months, as my pregnancy progressed and our daughter grew stronger inside me, I made decisions that prioritized my peace over Nolan's comfort, my future over his regrets. The birth itself was transformational in ways I hadn't expected. As I held our daughter for the first time, Emma Rose, named after my grandmother, I felt something click into place. This tiny person with her perfectly formed fingers and serious dark eyes represented everything I'd fought for. Not just the pregnancy itself but my right to make choices about my own life. Nolan was there, had been throughout the labor, holding my hand when I let him, stepping back when I needed space. When Emma was placed in my arms, I saw him cry, real tears, not the calculated emotion of his campaign to win me back, but genuine overwhelm at meeting his daughter. "She's perfect," he whispered, his finger tracing her tiny hand. "Yes," I agreed. "She is." But even in that moment of shared wonder, I knew our family would look different than the one I'd once imagined. The trust activated automatically upon Emma's birth, just as William had designed it. Within weeks, I was managing a rental property that generated enough monthly income to cover Emma's future education expenses. The stock portfolio provided additional security, and my 40% stake in Foster & Sons Hardware meant I now had a voice in business decisions that affected our financial future. Nolan watched this transfer of power with a complex mix of emotions: pride in his daughter, grief for what he'd lost, and a grudging respect for his father's foresight. He never once challenged the arrangements, perhaps understanding that any attempt to contest his father's will would only highlight his own manipulation and greed. 6 months after Emma's birth, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I enrolled in business management courses at the community college, taking advantage of their evening program while Nolan watched Emma during his scheduled visits. "You're going back to school?" my sister Rachel asked during one of our weekly coffee dates. "At 35 with a new baby? Why not?" I bounced Emma gently in my arms, marveling at how natural motherhood felt despite everything that had led to it. The trust provides financial stability, and I finally have the freedom to pursue something for myself. The freedom was intoxicating. For the first time in my adult life, I was making choices based purely on what I wanted, not what someone else expected or demanded. I studied marketing and accounting, learned about property management and investment strategies. Knowledge became another form of independence. Nolan and I settled into a co-parenting arrangement that worked because I controlled every aspect of it. He saw Emma twice a week, Tuesday evenings and Saturday afternoons, plus every other weekend. The schedule was my design, implemented on my timeline with boundaries I enforced consistently. "I'd like to take her to the park this Saturday," he might suggest during one of our brief handoff conversations. "Which park?" I'd ask. "The one on Elm Street with the good playground. Be back by 4. She has a routine." He never argued, never pushed for more time or different arrangements. Perhaps he understood that cooperation was the only path to any relationship with his daughter. Perhaps he'd finally learned that my boundaries weren't suggestions. The business courses led to unexpected opportunities. Professor Martinez, coincidentally sharing a name with the doctor who'd helped me discover Nolan's deception, mentioned that Foster & Sons Hardware was looking for someone to modernize their marketing approach. "You own part of that business, don't you?" she asked after class one evening. 40%, I confirmed. "Have you considered getting more involved? Bringing some fresh perspectives to their operations?" The idea hadn't occurred to me, but once planted, it grew quickly. I scheduled a meeting with the current manager, brought proposals for online sales platforms and social media marketing, suggested efficiency improvements based on what I'd learned about small business operations. Within 6 months, I was working part-time as Foster & Sons marketing and operations consultant. The additional income wasn't necessary. The trust provided more than enough security, but the work gave me purpose and professional identity I'd never had during my marriage. Nolan heard about my involvement through the family grapevine. When he brought Emma back from a Saturday visit, he lingered longer than usual. "I heard you're working at the hardware store now," he said, his tone carefully neutral. 3 days a week. Emma comes with me sometimes. She likes watching the customers." That's great, Chloe. Really. Dad would have loved seeing you take an active role in the business." It was one of the few times he'd mentioned his father without bitterness, and I recognized it as genuine. Whatever resentment he felt about the trust, he seemed to understand that his father's decision had been protective rather than punitive. The personal growth extended beyond professional achievements. I learned to speak up in situations where the old Chloe would have remained silent. When Emma's pediatrician suggested a treatment approach I disagreed with, I voiced my concerns and sought a second opinion. When a neighbor made comments about single mothers that felt judgmental, I corrected his assumptions about my situation with polite firmness. "You've changed," Rachel observed during one of our coffee dates, watching me confidently handle a difficult server who'd gotten our order wrong. "Have I?" I shifted Emma to my other arm, noting how natural the movement had become. The old Chloe would have just accepted the wrong order and pretended it was fine. He was right. The woman who'd silently endured months of cruel phone calls was gone, replaced by someone who understood that peace didn't require accepting mistreatment. Even my relationship with Emma carried lessons about power and choice. When she cried inconsolably during her colicky phase, I learned that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is set firm boundaries. Putting her in her crib for 5 minutes while I collected myself, rather than letting frustration build to dangerous levels. "You're a natural at this," Nolan said one evening when he picked her up and she immediately calmed in his arms. "I'm learning," I corrected. "There's a difference." The distinction mattered. Natural implied some innate ability, but learning suggested conscious choice and effort. Everything about my new life had been learned, chosen, deliberately constructed rather than simply accepted. 18 months after Emma's birth, I had occasion to drive past Murphy's diner. The same red vinyl booths were visible through the windows, the same checkered floor that had witnessed my confrontation with Mila. But instead of painful memories, I felt only quiet satisfaction. That afternoon had been the beginning of everything. Not just Mila's downfall or Nolan's consequences, but my own transformation. The moment I'd slid that will across the table, I'd stopped being a victim and started being the author of my own story. Through mutual acquaintances, I'd learned that Mila had indeed married, to a divorced architect in Phoenix who apparently appreciated her intelligence and ambition. Good for her. Everyone deserved a chance at happiness, even someone who'd once taken pleasure in causing pain. I rarely thought about her anymore except when something reminded me of that time, like driving past Murphy's or hearing a phone ring at 7:43 p.m. Those moments served as reminders of how far I'd traveled, not as sources of ongoing anger. Emma babbled from her car seat as we passed the diner, pointing at something outside her window with the serious concentration of a 15-month-old making important observations about the world. "That's right, sweetheart," I said, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "There's a lot to see out there." And there was. A life I'd built through patience and strategic thinking rather than drama and revenge. A future that belonged entirely to us, free from the toxic patterns that had once defined my daily existence. The woman who'd once listened silently to cruelty was gone. In her place was someone who spoke up, who made choices, who protected what mattered most. Someone who understood that true power wasn't about controlling others. It was about never again allowing others to control you. If this story of strategic revenge had you holding your breath, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Chloe slid that will across the table, watching Mila's confidence crumble completely. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more empowering stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload. Husband sneering. Still throwing yourself at men for attention, I see. Wife calmly. That man was the forensic accountant tracing your embezzlement. By the way she slides the papers across the table, you can tell. These are updated divorce papers. You now owe me 70% after hiding assets. Husband laughing nervously. You'll never prove. The door bursts open, police stride in. Wife smiling sweetly. Oops, your mistress flipped first. Funny, I hired her to seduce you. I never meant to find it. The statement was buried on page 17 of Reed's corporate credit card bill. A transaction at Tiffany's for $8,743 that occurred while he was supposedly closing deals in Chicago. I froze, my cup of tea suspended midway to my lips as reality shifted beneath me. Business expenses, he'd always say with that practiced smile whenever I asked about our finances. Nothing for you to worry about, Hope. But that's exactly what I'd been doing for 10 years. Not worrying, not questioning, not seeing. Our sprawling suburban home suddenly felt like a beautiful prison, the silence deafening as I spread the financial statements across our kitchen island. With Reed away for another 3 days, I had time. For once, I had time to really look. The discrepancies weren't even particularly well hidden, as if he'd grown lazy with confidence. Transfers to accounts I'd never heard of. Regular withdrawals that matched no household expenses. A pattern of financial deception that had likely been happening right under my nose for years. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank each of you for being part of this incredible journey. If you're enjoying these stories of empowerment, consider subscribing. It's completely free and helps us build this amazing community. Let's dive in. I remember touching my wedding ring, twisting it nervously as I had so many times before when Reed would sigh dramatically at my questions, making me feel small for asking. "You never did understand business, Hope," he'd say, his voice dripping with that particular brand of condescension he reserved just for me. "That's why I handle the money. Stick to your charity work." My charity work. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent years raising funds for domestic violence victims while slowly becoming a different kind of victim myself. I opened my laptop and began taking photos of everything, my hands trembling but my mind suddenly, startlingly clear. The trembling wasn't from fear this time, it was adrenaline. Something inside me had finally cracked open. The gaslighting started so gradually I barely noticed. Early in our marriage, it was almost charming how Reed would tease me about my terrible memory, when I'd recall conversations differently than he did. "That's not what happened, babe," he'd say with a laugh. "But it's cute how you mix things up." 3 years in, I stopped trusting my own recollections entirely, conceding to his version of events to avoid the exhausting arguments that would follow if I didn't. "If you say so, Reed," became my mantra, the path of least resistance. By year 5, the public humiliations had become routine. At his office Christmas party, I'd mentioned reading an article about market fluctuations. Reed had placed his hand on my shoulder, squeezing just a little too hard as he smiled at his colleagues. "Don't mind Hope," he'd said, his voice light but his eyes cold. "She thinks reading the Wall Street Journal headline once makes her Warren Buffett. Stick to your strengths, honey. You look beautiful tonight and that's what matters." Everyone had laughed politely. I'd smiled too, dying inside as I always did. Later that night, I spent an hour crying silently in our bathroom while Reed slept soundly, untroubled. The isolation happened next. My friends didn't understand our lifestyle. My sister was jealous of our success. My parents never approved of ambition. One by one, Reed found reasons to cut the connections to my support network until it was just him and his version of reality, which I was expected to accept without question. The charity gala last month was where something finally broke inside me. I'd been speaking with Dr. James Cooper, a cardiologist who'd made a generous donation to the children's hospital wing our foundation was funding. We were discussing the impact of early intervention programs when Reed appeared at my side, champagne flute in hand and that familiar social smile plastered on his face. "Still throwing yourself at men for attention, I see," he murmured against my ear, his breath hot and his voice carrying just enough for Dr. Cooper to shift uncomfortably. "Dr. Cooper was just telling me about the new pediatric cardiology initiative," I'd explained, feeling the familiar flush of embarrassment creep up my neck. "I'm sure he was," Reed had replied with a wink toward the doctor. "Hope loves to network. She's so passionate about causes." The way he said it made charitable work sound like a character flaw. That night, something crystallized within me. I watched Reed work the room, charming and confident, while I stood frozen in a corner, wondering how I'd become this shadow of myself. The woman who had graduated top of her class in business administration, who had once been headhunted by investment firms, who had dreams beyond being Reed Morgan's perfectly groomed wife. 2 days after the gala, I made my first appointment with Dr. Abrams. Finding a therapist Reed didn't know through his extensive network had been challenging, but I'd been careful. Very careful. "What you're describing is a classic pattern of emotional abuse," Dr. Abrams had said during our 3rd session, her gray eyes kind but unflinching. "The isolation from support systems, the public humiliation, the gaslighting, these are control tactics, Hope." I'd flinched at the word abuse. It seemed too harsh, too dramatic for what I was experiencing. There were no bruises to photograph, no broken bones to set. "But he's never hit me," I'd whispered. Emotional abuse leaves invisible wounds, she'd replied. But they're just as real and often take longer to heal. I'd cried then for the first time in front of another person in years. The relief of being believed, of having my reality validated, was overwhelming. What should I do? I'd asked, wiping my tears. Confront him. Dr. Abrams had considered this carefully. Confrontation with abusers rarely goes as planned, Hope. They're skilled at turning situations to their advantage. Before you make any decisions, I think you need more information. Especially given these financial irregularities you've noticed. That conversation was still echoing in my mind as I sat at our kitchen island, staring at the evidence of Reed's financial deceptions. Something had shifted inside me, a seed of determination taking root where fear and doubt had lived for so long. I closed the financial statements and carefully returned them to Reed's home office, making sure everything was exactly as I'd found it. Then I opened a new document on my laptop and began to type, investigation plan. I wasn't going to confront Reed. Not yet. First, I would build a case, meticulously, strategically, leaving nothing to chance. The financial executive he'd belittled for years was awakening from a long slumber. I would follow the paper trail wherever it led, and I would reclaim my life, piece by carefully documented piece. For the first time in years, I felt something that had been foreign to me in my marriage. Power. And I intended to use it. Finding Bryce Cohen wasn't easy. I needed someone Reed couldn't trace back to me, someone outside his extensive network of financial professionals. My college roommate, Melissa, now worked for the FBI in their financial crimes division. We hadn't spoken in years, another casualty of Reed's systematic isolation, but her Facebook profile was still active. It's been too long, she said when we met for coffee at a small cafe 40 minutes from our neighborhood. I'd told Reed I was attending a foundation meeting. I always wondered what happened to us. I carefully sidestepped her implied question. I need someone who can trace financial irregularities, Mel. Someone discreet, thorough, and not connected to Boston's financial elite. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Is everything okay, Hope? It will be, I replied, surprised by my own certainty. 3 days later, I sat across from Bryce Cohen in his modest office in Cambridge. With his rumpled button-down shirt and direct gaze, he was nothing like the polished financial advisors in Reed's circle. Mrs. Morgan, he began. Please call me Hope. Hope then. Your friend Melissa speaks highly of you. He leaned forward. She mentioned potential financial misconduct. I should be clear. If there's criminal activity, there are reporting obligations I can't ignore. I slid a USB drive across his desk. These are copies of statements I've gathered. Nothing conclusive yet, but enough to raise questions. I need to know what I'm dealing with before I make any decisions. Bryce inserted the drive, and his expression remained neutral as he scanned the documents. You've done preliminary work already. I have a business degree gathering dust, I said with a small smile. And motivation. He nodded. This will take time. And it won't be cheap. I have resources he doesn't know about, I assured him. A trust from my grandmother that Reed never touched. It should be enough. Bryce's eyes met mine. You've thought this through. I'm just getting started. My education began that night. While Reed slept soundly beside me, I slipped out of bed to the guest bathroom, laptop balanced on my knees as I sat on the cold tile floor. I'd developed a system, 30 minutes of research, then clear the browser history, shut down and return to bed. Reed never noticed my absence. He'd stopped paying attention to my movements years ago, secure in his control. I devoured articles on financial forensics, learning about cash flow analysis, asset tracing and document examination. I created a dedicated email account accessed only through a VPN. I purchased a prepaid phone with cash. The woman who had once meekly accepted Reed's financial expertise was methodically arming herself with knowledge. 3 weeks after our initial meeting, Bryce called my secret phone during my regular grocery shopping trip. We need to meet, he said without preamble. I found something. The something turned out to be 3 offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, each containing transfers from Reed's primary business account disguised as consulting fees to non-existent companies. He's been siphoning funds for at least 5 years, Bryce explained, pointing to a timeline he'd constructed. Conservative estimate, Approximately $4 million hidden from both the business and your marital assets. My hand trembled slightly as I touched the paper. Can we trace where the money came from? That's where it gets interesting, Bryce said, a glint of professional excitement in his eyes. Some appears to be legitimate business revenue that should have been reported as profit. But a portion comes from accounts I can't fully identify yet. The pattern suggests possible investor funds being redirected. You mean embezzlement? I mean we need more evidence, he corrected carefully. But yes, that's where this is pointing. I took a deep breath. What's our next step? We need internal documents I can't access externally. Financial statements, investor agreements, board minutes. Anything that shows the legitimate path this money should have taken. I nodded, already formulating a plan. I can get those. Creating my documentation system became an art form. I converted a weathered Kate Spade tote that Reed had always disdained into my mobile command center. False bottom installed, it held a slim camera, my secondary phone, and a notebook with a coded system of my own devising. When Reed hosted business associates for dinner, I played my role perfectly, the attentive wife refilling wine glasses, then tactfully disappearing when conversation turned to business matters. But instead of retiring upstairs, I'd slip into Reed's study, photographing documents he'd carelessly left accessible. I developed a ritual for these covert operations, 20 minutes maximum, focusing on specific documents Bryce had requested. I'd memorized the exact placement of everything in Reed's office, developed a sixth sense for which floorboards creaked. The rush of fear and power was intoxicating. The offshore accounts were just the beginning. Working with Bryce, we uncovered a complex web of financial deception, falsified profit reports to investors, manipulated tax filings, and systematic hiding of marital assets. Reed hadn't just been controlling our marriage. He'd built his entire career on manipulation and fraud. This goes beyond divorce proceedings, Bryce warned during one of our meetings. We're looking at potential federal charges. I'd nodded, unexpectedly calm. I need to speak with a lawyer. Catherine Wells's office projected exactly the kind of power I wanted in my corner. Understated elegance with steel underneath. At 62, she had a reputation as Boston's most formidable divorce attorney, known for her methodical dismantling of financial deceptions. Most spouses come to me with suspicions and maybe a bank statement they found in the laundry, Catherine said, reviewing the precisely organized file I'd brought. You've practically built the case already. I had help, I acknowledged. She looked up, her keen eyes assessing me. This level of financial misconduct changes everything. We're not just talking about an equitable division of assets. With evidence of intentionally hidden marital property and possible criminal activity, we could potentially secure a significantly larger settlement. What percentage? I asked, the business major in me emerging. Typically, Massachusetts aims for equitable distribution, often around 50-50 in long-term marriages. But with this level of misconduct. Her smile was sharp. I've secured up to 70% for clients in similar situations. And that's before we consider potential punitive damages. I absorbed this information silently. This is an extraordinary case, Mrs. Morgan, Catherine said, closing the file. But I should warn you, men like your husband don't surrender quietly. He will fight back, possibly ruthlessly. Are you prepared for what comes next? For a moment, I saw flashes of the past decade. The subtle undermining, the controlled isolation, the calculated diminishment of my confidence. Then I remembered the steel I'd discovered within myself these past months. Call me hope, I said. And yes, I'm more than ready. We need concrete evidence of his intentions, Catherine explained during our second meeting. Financial documents establish the pattern of fraud, but personal communications would strengthen our position immensely. Reed is careful with his digital footprint, I replied. He uses separate devices for his indiscretions. Catherine's perfectly arched eyebrow lifted slightly. Have there been many? Enough, I said, surprised by my lack of emotion. The betrayals had lost their sting, replaced by a cold, analytical focus. What if? I hesitated, the idea forming as I spoke. What if someone could get close to him? Someone he'd trust with his secrets. Catherine leaned back in her chair. You're suggesting a honey trap. I'm suggesting we give Reed exactly what he's always wanted, validation of his own irresistibility. Finding Naomi Mitchell was Catherine's contribution. My niece is in law school at Boston University. She knows a student there, brilliant, struggling financially with theater experience. Completely outside Reed's social circles. Naomi had the kind of beauty Reed couldn't resist, confident yet seemingly obtainable. We met at a small coffee shop near the university, where I laid out my proposition. "Let me get this straight," she said, stirring her latte methodically. "You want me to pretend to be interested in your husband, record his conversations and get him to reveal financial misconduct?" "Yes." "And you're not upset about the implications of this arrangement?" I smiled thinly. Reed stopped being faithful about 3 months after our wedding. I'm well past jealousy. Naomi studied me with surprising intensity. This could get complicated. It already is. That's why I need someone smart enough to navigate the complications without getting lost in them. She was silent for a long moment. "Law school is expensive," she finally said. "And working part-time at the library barely covers ramen. I can offer $20,000, plus bonuses for actionable evidence. All expenses covered, of course." Her eyes widened slightly. "With that kind of money I could graduate without additional debt. Consider it an alternative legal internship. Just with better compensation than most." She laughed then, a genuine sound that surprised both of us. "When do we start?" The training sessions began the following week. In my hotel room. Never my house, never anywhere Reed might have connections. I created a detailed profile of my husband. Reed responds to intellectual challenge followed by deference, I explained, pacing as Naomi took notes. He likes to feel superior, but only after establishing that you're worthy of his time. Appeal to his expertise, but demonstrate enough knowledge to be interesting. What about physical preferences? Naomi asked pragmatically. I hesitated only briefly. Conservative in public. Tailored dresses, nothing flashy. He dislikes obvious attempts at seduction. It makes conquest too easy. In private, he likes to feel in control. Naomi nodded, her expression professional. And what specific information are we looking for? Details about investor meetings, access to his private office, any mention of offshore accounts or entities called Meridian Holdings, Apex Consultants, or Blue Horizon Limited. We spent hours crafting Naomi's character. Naomi Reynolds, recent MBA graduate with family money looking for investment opportunities. We studied photographs of Reed's office, practiced conversation scenarios, and established emergency protocols. What if he doesn't take the bait? Naomi asked during our third session. I smiled. Reed has never met a challenge he could resist. Especially one that strokes his ego. Creating Naomi's backstory required meticulous attention to detail. We established a digital footprint, carefully backdated social media profiles, a professional website showcasing her fictional investment portfolio, even business cards and letterhead for her family office. Everything needs to withstand scrutiny, Bryce advised as he helped construct her financial background. Reed will verify her story. We arranged for Naomi to accidentally meet Reed at his favorite lunch spot, an upscale bistro where he took potential clients. She would carry investment prospectuses, appear frustrated by a phone call, and create an opportunity for Reed to offer assistance. The morning of their planned encounter, I felt an unexpected wave of nausea. Not from jealousy, but from the strangeness of orchestrating this elaborate deception. For a moment, I wondered what had happened to the woman who once believed in direct communication and honesty. Are you sure about this? Naomi asked, seeming to sense my hesitation as we finalized details by phone. Yes, I replied firmly, pushing doubts aside. Reed forfeited honesty years ago. Watching the plan unfold through Naomi's recordings was surreal. She wore a specialized recording device provided by a private investigator Catherine recommended. Expensive but undetectable. I couldn't help but notice those prospectuses. Reed's voice came through the speaker, that familiar tone of calculated charm sending chills down my spine. Alternative energy investments? That's an area of particular interest to me. Naomi played her role perfectly, competent yet deferential, intriguing without being obvious. By the end of their chance meeting, Reed had suggested a follow-up conversation about potential investment opportunities. That was uncomfortable, Naomi admitted when we debriefed that evening. He's very smooth. Years of practice, I replied. Over the following weeks, Naomi gained Reed's confidence with remarkable efficiency. Their meetings moved from public restaurants to his private office. Their conversations from general investment discussions to specific opportunities with his firm. Each recording revealed more of Reed's calculated manipulation. The same techniques he'd used on me now deployed on Naomi. The familiar patterns were both validating and painful to witness. He mentioned Meridian Holdings today, Naomi reported excitedly after their 5th meeting. Said it was a special opportunity for select investors. When I expressed interest, he hinted that formal investment channels were unnecessarily restrictive. That's it, I whispered. That's the connection we needed. I hadn't anticipated the friendship that developed between Naomi and me. What began as strictly professional meetings evolved into conversations that stretched late into evenings. My ex-boyfriend was similar. Naomi confided one night over takeout containers in my hotel room. Not as sophisticated as Reed, but the same playbook, isolation, subtle criticism disguised as concern, making me question my own perception. How did you get out? I asked. My roommate staged an intervention. Showed me text he'd sent her trying to hook up while we were together. She smiled grimly. Sometimes you need external evidence to trust your own instincts. I nodded. That's exactly what we're doing, gathering evidence. Not just for the court, Naomi said thoughtfully. For you too. Validation that you weren't crazy all those years. Her insight startled me. This law student had seen through to the heart of my mission in a way I hadn't fully acknowledged to myself. As weeks passed and evidence accumulated, Naomi became more than an operative. She became my confidant, perhaps my first real friend in years. The irony wasn't lost on me. That in setting a trap for my manipulative husband, I'd found an authentic connection I'd been missing. He's invited me to the charity gala next weekend, Naomi said during our latest update. Said it's time I met his associates. I froze. That's where I'll be. As his wife. We stared at each other, understanding the perfect climax this presented, and the perfect risk. Then I guess it's time for the next phase, Naomi said with quiet determination. Are you ready? I took a deep breath. More than you know. The charity gala loomed 3 days away, and with it the converging of my two carefully separated worlds. That morning I stood in our master bathroom, applying mascara with practiced precision while Reed showered. My reflection showed the same Hope Morgan I'd been for years, poised, attractive, unthreatening, while inside, an entirely different woman calculated her next move. I'm having my tux pressed for Saturday, Reed called over the sound of running water. Wear the blue Vera Wang. The donors respond well to it. Of course, I replied, my voice pleasant and accommodating. The perfect wife right on cue. I've already scheduled my hair appointment. Good girl, he said absently. I watched my reflection carefully, making sure no flash of anger showed in my eyes at his condescending praise. The art of self-control had become second nature over our 10-year marriage, but these past months had elevated it to a masterclass in deception. When he left for work, I made my usual show of kissing him goodbye at the door, reminding him about dinner that evening with his board member Lawrence. The moment his car disappeared down our tree-lined street, I moved quickly to the guest bedroom closet. Behind winter coats and seldom-used luggage, I'd created a small hidden repository. Using a step stool, I reached past the air vent, a space Reed would never think to check, and retrieved a small lockbox. Inside were the items that mattered most. My grandmother's jewelry that Reed thought I'd put in the bank vault, original copies of my academic credentials, family photographs from before Reed had systematically removed them from our home, claiming they clashed with the decor. I added these to the growing collection in my safety deposit box at a bank across town. A bank where Reed had no connections. Item by item, I was extracting the evidence of my true self from our shared life. Financial independence had been my first priority. The trust from my grandmother had remained untouched throughout our marriage. Something Reed had dismissed as sentimental nonsense, not worth his financial expertise. Now it provided the foundation for my escape. Working with a financial advisor Catherine had recommended, a woman who specialized in helping clients leave controlling relationships. I had established new accounts, secured credit in my name alone, and begun the process of building my separate financial identity. You're ahead of most clients, Diane had told me during our last meeting. Most women in your situation don't have access to their own funds. Reed's focus was always on control, not protection, I explained. He wanted to manage our daily finances, but never bothered to investigate what I might have independently. His arrogance is our advantage, she'd replied with a knowing smile. The first close call came in late March. I'd been photographing documents in Reed's home office when I heard the garage door opener, hours before he was expected home. His meeting must have ended early. Heart pounding, I quickly replaced the files, closed his drawer, and opened instead the household accounts I legitimately managed. When he entered his office 30 seconds later, he found me at his desk with a checkbook and calculator. "What are you doing in here?" His tone carried that edge of suspicion I'd learned to fear. "The landscaper needs payment for the spring planting," I explained, gesturing to the checkbook. I couldn't remember if we'd agreed on the boxwoods or the hydrangeas for the east garden. He frowned. "You could have called me." "I didn't want to interrupt your meeting," I said, standing to give him access to his desk. "How did it go with the investors?" "The diversion worked." Reed launched into a self-congratulatory account of his presentation, his momentary suspicion forgotten in the pleasure of recounting his own brilliance. Later that night, I sat on the bathroom floor, shaking with delayed adrenaline. The close call had rattled me more than I wanted to admit, bringing back the familiar feeling of walking on eggshells that had characterized so much of our marriage. "Focus," I whispered to myself. "Just a little longer." Living two completely separate lives exacted a toll I hadn't fully anticipated. The constant vigilance, monitoring my expressions, moderating my tone, maintaining the fiction of normalcy, was exhausting in ways I couldn't have imagined. I developed rituals to keep myself centered. Each morning before Reed woke, I would stand in our backyard, feeling the grass beneath my bare feet, reminding myself that this deception was temporary, that I was working toward freedom. Dr. Abrams helped me manage the psychological strain during our weekly sessions, now conducted under the guise of volunteer committee meetings. "What you're doing is necessary," she reminded me during a particularly difficult week. "But it comes with costs. You're essentially operating as an undercover agent in your own life." "Sometimes I wonder if I'm becoming like him," I confessed. "Using manipulation, hiding the truth." "The difference is intent," she said firmly. "You're seeking justice and protection, not control and domination. Don't lose sight of that distinction." Still, there were moments of doubt. Nights when I lay beside the man I was methodically destroying, wondering if there had been another path. Mornings when the weight of secrets felt too heavy to bear. During those moments, I would remember the years of subtle cruelty, the systematic dismantling of my confidence, the financial betrayals that went beyond our marriage to affect innocent investors. The clarity would return along with my resolve. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place unexpectedly. Reed had been unusually distracted at breakfast, checking his phone repeatedly, his usual smooth composure slightly frayed. "Everything all right?" I asked, pouring his coffee with practiced domestic care. "Fine," he snapped, then immediately modulated his tone. "Just a hiccup with the Meridian account." I nodded sympathetically while my internal alarms blared. Meridian, the same entity Naomi had been tracking through her conversations with Reed. That afternoon, while Reed was at his club playing racquetball, I made an unexpected visit to his office, bringing lunch to his secretary Linda. After years of being the perfect corporate wife, these small gestures were expected, even appreciated. "You're a lifesaver," Linda said, accepting the gourmet sandwich. "It's been chaos here today." "Oh, what happened?" I asked, my voice casual as I arranged napkins on her desk. "Some issue with overseas compliance," she said between bites. "Mr. Morgan has been on calls with the Cayman office all morning." I nodded sympathetically. Regulations can be so tedious. "Especially with the FBI nosing around that investment group in Miami," she added, lowering her voice. "The one Mr. Morgan consulted for last year." My heart nearly stopped, but my expression remained one of mild interest. How frustrating for him. That evening, I called Bryce from my secure phone. "We need to look into FBI investigations of investment groups in Miami. Specifically any connected to Reed's consulting work last year." 2 days later, Bryce confirmed what I had suspected. The FBI was investigating a Miami-based investment group for potential money laundering, a group Reed had consulted for according to his tax records. The same group that had connections to one of the Cayman Island accounts we'd been tracking. This goes beyond embezzlement or hiding marital assets, Bryce warned. Money laundering carries serious federal penalties. I sat in my hotel room, absorbing this final revelation. Reed hadn't just been stealing from our marriage or even just his investors. He'd potentially been involved in laundering money for who knows what kind of operations. What do we do now? I asked Catherine during an emergency meeting that evening. Her expression was grave but determined. Now we accelerate our timeline. The charity gala this weekend is no longer just a confrontation point. It's our best opportunity to end this before the criminal investigation potentially complicates our strategy. I nodded, a strange calm settling over me. After months of calculated patience, the endgame was suddenly, startlingly clear. I'll be ready, I promised. The plan came together with precise, almost surgical detail. Catherine, Bryce, Naomi, and I spent the entire day before the gala in Catherine's office, refining every element of the confrontation. Timing is everything, Catherine emphasized, tapping her pen against the timeline we'd created. The divorce papers need to be served at exactly the right moment. After Reed's shown his true colors to the witnesses but before he can regain control of the narrative. Bryce nodded, adjusting his glasses. And we need to make sure the financial evidence is presented in a way that's clear even to the non-experts in the room. What about the police? I asked. Are we certain they'll arrive at the right time? My contact at the Financial Crimes Unit confirmed they've been building their own case, Catherine reassured me. They're more than happy to coordinate. Your evidence was the missing piece they needed. Naomi's role had been carefully calibrated. She would arrive after the initial confrontation, providing the final piece of evidence that would complete Reed's unraveling. As we finalized the details, I felt a strange sense of calm. After months of fear, deception, and careful planning, the end was finally in sight. Are you sure you're ready for this? Naomi asked quietly as we left the meeting. Once we start, there's no going back. I thought about the decade of my life spent under Reed's control, the systematic erosion of my confidence, the financial crimes that had victimized not just me but countless investors. I've been ready for years, I replied. I just didn't know it until now. The evening of reckoning arrived with picture-perfect clarity. Reed had arranged a pre-gala dinner with his most important business partners at Maison Laurent, Boston's most exclusive restaurant. The guest list included Lawrence and Patricia Whitfield, major investors in Reed's firm, Senator James Harrison, whose campaign Reed had generously supported, and Martin Chin, Reed's oldest friend and business partner. I wore the blue Vera Wang as instructed, my hair and makeup flawlessly appropriate for the corporate wife Reed had cultivated. In my clutch rested the sealed envelope Catherine had prepared, divorce papers calculating a 70% settlement based on the evidence of hidden assets and financial misconduct. Throughout the appetizer course, I played my role with practiced precision, smiling at the right moments, asking appropriate questions about the Whitfields' recent vacation to the Maldives. Reed barely acknowledged my presence except to order for me salmon, not the steak I would have preferred, a small control tactic he'd employed throughout our marriage. Hope doesn't have the palate for rare meat, he explained to the table with his familiar indulgent smile. Too delicate. I smiled thinly, noting Patricia Whitfield's slight frown at his condescension. The conversation turned to business during the main course. Reed dominated as always, outlining his vision for expanding their investment portfolio into emerging markets. The regulatory environment overseas offers certain flexibilities, he explained, swirling his bourbon. My contacts in the Cayman Islands have been particularly helpful in maximizing our returns. Lawrence Whitfield nodded appreciatively. The quarterly statements have been impressive. Whatever you're doing, it's working. I took a small sip of water, watching Reed bask in the admiration. The familiar pattern, Reed positioning himself as the financial genius while dismissing anyone who might question his methods. Hope was just saying she'd love to understand more about the business side. I interjected smoothly, setting my trap. Weren't you, darling? Reed's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Hope's strengths lie elsewhere. The financial complexities would only bore her. "Try me," I said quietly, my tone light but my eyes challenging. Reed laughed, turning to the table. "My wife suddenly fancies herself an investment expert. Next thing she'll want a seat on the board." The dismissive chuckle that followed was precisely what I'd been waiting for. The public diminishment that had been his pattern for years. "Actually," I said, reaching for my clutch, "I've developed quite an interest in financial forensics lately." Reed's expression froze slightly as I removed the envelope. "What's this?" he asked, his tone still light but with an undertone of wariness. "Updated divorce papers," I replied calmly, sliding them across the table. "You now owe me 70% after hiding assets." The silence that descended on the table was absolute. Reed's face cycled through expressions: confusion, disbelief, then the beginning of his practiced damage control smile. "Hope's been under tremendous stress lately," he began, reaching to take the envelope before anyone could examine it. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately. The stress of discovering my husband has been embezzling from his own company and clients?" I interrupted, my voice steady. "Or the stress of finding out about the money laundering connections in Miami?" Lawrence Whitfield's fork clattered against his plate. Senator Harrison shifted uncomfortably. Martin Chen's expression hardened into something dangerous. "You'll never prove any of this," Reed hissed, his facade cracking. "You don't have the resources or the intelligence." "But I do," came a familiar voice from behind him. Reed turned to find Naomi standing there. Not as the seductive potential investor he'd been cultivating, but as a clear-eyed witness in a professional suit, holding a recording device. "Naomi Reynolds," she introduced herself to the table. "Or actually Naomi Mitchell. Law student and state-licensed private investigator assistant." Reed's face drained of color. "What is this?" "This," I said as the restaurant's main doors opened to admit three serious-looking individuals in dark suits, "is Justice Reed Morgan," the lead agent said, approaching our table. "I'm Special Agent Davis with the FBI. We have some questions about your connections to Meridian Holdings and certain financial transactions in Miami." The aftermath unfolded with stunning swiftness. Reed was taken for questioning while the dinner guests sat in shocked silence. Patricia Whitfield reached over to squeeze my hand briefly, a small gesture of female solidarity that brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "How long have you known?" Martin asked quietly as the others began gathering their belongings. "Long enough to do something about it," I replied. "The evidence has been turned over to the authorities. You might want to contact your lawyer." He nodded grimly. "For what it's worth, I didn't know about Miami." "But you knew about the rest," I stated rather than asked. His silence was answer enough. 3 months later, I sat on the patio of my new apartment overlooking the Charles River. The legal proceedings were still ongoing, but the immediate outcomes had exceeded even Catherine's expectations. Reed had been denied bail due to flight risk after investigators discovered packed bags and a private plane on standby. The evidence I'd gathered had led to multiple federal charges, with former associates like Martin turning state's evidence to save themselves. My phone buzzed with a text from Naomi. "Pass the bar exam. Celebration dinner tonight." I smiled, typing back a quick confirmation. Our unlikely friendship had deepened in the aftermath, with Naomi accepting a position at Catherine's firm after graduation. Dr. Abrams had warned me that justice wouldn't automatically bring healing. "The legal victory is just the beginning," she'd cautioned. "The emotional recovery takes longer." He was right. There were still nights I woke up in a cold sweat, momentarily trapped in the psychological prison Reed had constructed. Days when I second-guessed my own decisions, hearing his voice in my head questioning my competence. But those moments were becoming less frequent. The woman who had meticulously constructed Reed's downfall was discovering she could build something else just as carefully, a new life defined by her own choices. I took a sip of tea, watching the sunset reflect off the river. The financial settlement would ensure I never had to worry about money again. More importantly, the frozen accounts Reed had hidden offshore were being used to compensate the investors he'd defrauded. Justice, it turned out, could indeed be served cold. But the life that followed could still be warm with possibility. My daughter's wedding planner pulled me aside. "The groom is after her inheritance." I smiled as he toasted with our family's rarest crystal. During the mother-daughter dance I whispered, "Let him laugh tonight, sweetheart. By sunrise he'll realize. Some absences are deliberate." The morning sun streamed through the cathedral windows, casting golden rays across empty pews that would soon fill with guests. I stood in the bridal suite doorway, watching my daughter Emma adjust her veil for the 100th time. Her hands trembled, not with excitement but with something else. Something I recognized from my own reflection 30 years ago when I married her father. "Mom, do you think Zach will make it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I forced a smile, the same practiced expression I'd perfected through decades of charity galas and business dinners. "Sweetheart, you know your brother. He'll be here when it matters." But even as the words left my lips, I knew they weren't true. Zach's chair would remain empty today and every guest would notice. They always did when something was missing from a picture that should have been perfect. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me. If you believe in the power of protective love and family bonds, please subscribe. It's free and helps us reach more people who need these stories. The empty seat that no one dared to ask about became the elephant in the room before the ceremony even began. I watched as guests filtered in, their eyes inevitably drawn to the front row where Zach should have been sitting. Aunt Margaret leaned over to whisper something to my sister-in-law, their heads bobbing in that conspiratorial way that made my teeth clench. Cousin Robert kept glancing at the vacant chair like it might suddenly produce my son. When Daniel's groomsman asked about it, he just shrugged with that easy charm of his. "You know how it is with corporate travel," he said, adjusting his boutonniere. "Zach's probably closing some deal in Tokyo right now." The lie rolled off his tongue so smoothly that I almost believed it myself. Almost. But I knew better. I knew exactly where my son was, and more importantly, I knew why he wasn't here. Daniel was charming. Devastatingly so. The kind of charming that made waitresses blush and elderly ladies pat his arm approvingly. But I'd spent 45 years reading people, first in boardrooms, then at PTA meetings, and finally across dinner tables where million-dollar deals were disguised as casual conversation. His charm felt manufactured, like cologne sprayed too heavily to cover something unpleasant underneath. During the ceremony, I watched him work the crowd with his eyes even while promising to love my daughter forever. He winked at her college roommate during the vows. He nodded approvingly at my business partner when the minister mentioned financial security. When he slipped the ring onto Emma's finger, I swear I saw him glance at her tennis bracelet, the one that had belonged to my grandmother, with the same look a jeweler gives when appraising merchandise. "You may kiss the bride," the minister announced, and Daniel did, with just enough passion to make the crowd sigh appreciatively. But his hand, I noticed, lingered on the pearl necklace at Emma's throat. The one worth more than most people's cars. The rehearsal dinner the night before had been my first real glimpse behind his mask. We'd reserved the private dining room at the country club, complete with crystal chandeliers and enough flowers to stock a botanical garden. Emma had insisted on perfection and I'd given it to her, even though each detail felt like another nail in a coffin I couldn't yet name. Daniel held court at the head table, regaling everyone with stories about his consulting work, his travels, his ambitious plans for the future. "Emma's going to make the perfect wife," he announced, raising his glass of our finest champagne. "She's got such a generous heart. Sometimes too generous, if you know what I mean." The table laughed politely, but I felt ice form in my chest. Emma's cheeks flushed pink and she laughed along, but it was the kind of laugh you make when you're trying to convince yourself something isn't wrong. "She's always been the emotional one in the family," Daniel continued, his arm tightening around her shoulders. "Good thing she's got me to keep her grounded, right?" I watched my daughter's smile falter for just a moment before she fixed it back in place. 26 years of being her mother, and I could read every micro-expression that crossed her face. That wasn't happiness. That was resignation wrapped in Vera Wang's silk. My fingers tightened around my wine glass until I worried it might shatter. Around the table, family members nodded and chuckled, oblivious to the subtle cruelty in his words. But I heard it. The way he diminished her while pretending to praise her. The way he positioned himself as her savior rather than her partner. The wedding planner, Margaret Chen, had been coordinating society events for 15 years. I'd worked with her on 3 charity galas, and she had an impeccable reputation for discretion. Which is why her approach before the ceremony shocked me to my core. She appeared at my elbow as I stood near the altar, checking that the flower arrangements were positioned correctly. Her usually professional demeanor had cracked, revealing something almost frantic underneath. "Mrs. Wellington," she whispered, glancing around to ensure we weren't overheard. "I need to tell you something and I hope you'll forgive me for overstepping." My heart began to race, though I kept my expression neutral. "What is it, Margaret?" She leaned closer, her voice barely audible above the organ music. "It's about Daniel. I've been in this business long enough to recognize certain patterns. The questions he's been asking about your family's assets, the way he's been researching property values in your neighborhood. Ma'am, I don't think he's marrying Emma for love." The words hit me like a physical blow, even though some part of me had been expecting them. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying he's marrying for the inheritance," she said quickly, her eyes darting toward the bridal suite where Emma was making final preparations. "I've seen it before. The charm, the rushed timeline, the way he talks about securing their future. I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. I stood there for a moment, feeling the cathedral walls close in around me. The morning sun suddenly felt cold against my skin, and the scent of lilies became overwhelming. "Thank you," I managed to say, my voice steadier than I felt. "For telling me." Margaret nodded quickly and disappeared into the crowd of vendors and family members, leaving me alone with the truth I'd been trying to avoid for months. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't march into the bridal suite and demand that Emma call off the wedding. Instead, I did what I'd always done when faced with impossible situations. I smiled, straightened my shoulders, and walked back to my seat in the front row, right next to that empty chair that suddenly felt like an omen. The mother-daughter dance came near the end of the reception, after Daniel had charmed every guest, kissed every grandmother, and posed for what felt like thousands of photographs. The band struck up "The Way You Look Tonight," the same song I'd danced to at my own wedding, and Emma floated into my arms like she was still my little girl, asking me to twirl her around the living room. For a moment, surrounded by the soft glow of candlelight and the gentle murmur of our guests, I almost forgot about Margaret's warning. Almost forgot about the calculated way Daniel's eyes tracked every piece of jewelry, every family heirloom on display. Almost forgot about Zach's empty chair and all the reasons behind it. But as we swayed together, I felt the weight of motherhood settle on my shoulders like a familiar coat. The responsibility to protect my daughter, even from herself. Even from choices she'd already made. I pulled her closer, close enough that my lips brushed her ear as we turned. "Let him laugh tonight, sweetheart," I whispered, the words coming from some deep, protective place I didn't even know existed. "By sunrise he'll realize. Some absences are deliberate." Emma pulled back slightly, confusion clouding her eyes. "Mom? What do you mean?" But I just smiled and continued dancing, letting the music carry us through the rest of the song. She wasn't ready for the truth yet. Neither was Daniel, sitting at the head table watching us with that proprietary smile of his. The evening air felt different as guests began to leave, couples walking hand in hand to their cars while Daniel posed for final photographs. I stood on the terrace watching my new son-in-law work the crowd, and I thought about absence. About the things we choose not to say, the people we choose not to invite, the truths we choose not to reveal. Zach's empty chair had spoken louder than any speech tonight. And tomorrow, Daniel would finally understand what that silence had been trying to tell him. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March, just as I was settling into my leather armchair with a cup of chamomile tea and the quarterly financial reports. The house felt cavernous without Emma's laughter echoing through the halls. She'd moved in with Daniel 3 months prior, claiming they needed to test-drive domestic life before the wedding. My phone buzzed against the mahogany side table. Zach's name appeared on the screen, which struck me as odd. My son rarely called during weeknights, preferring to save our conversations for Sunday morning coffee when he could give me his full attention. "Mom, I need you to sit down." His voice came through the speaker, steady but strained in a way that made my chest tighten. I was already seated, but something in his tone made me set down my teacup with deliberate care. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" "I've been helping Emma organize some of her old files from college. You know how she keeps everything in those banker's boxes in the garage?" His words came slowly, like he was choosing each one with surgical precision. "I found something. Actually, someone found me." The silence stretched between us, filled with the weight of unspoken dread. Zach had inherited my methodical nature, never one to dramatize or exaggerate. If he was calling with this kind of gravity, something was genuinely wrong. There's an email thread, Mom. Between Daniel and... He paused and I heard him take a shaky breath. Between Daniel and Lila. The name hit me like ice water. Lila Martinez, Emma's college roommate, maid of honor at her graduation party, the girl who'd spent countless holidays at our dinner table. The same Lila who'd vanished from Emma's life 2 years ago without explanation, leaving my daughter confused and heartbroken over the sudden loss of her closest friendship. Lila. I repeated, my voice barely above a whisper. But she and Emma haven't spoken since. Since she started dating Daniel, Zach finished. Mom, these emails, they're not old. They're current. And they're not friendly. My hands found the arms of my chair, gripping the worn leather as the room seemed to tilt around me. What kind of emails? The kind that prove Emma was never his first choice. Zach had always been thorough, a trait that served him well in his forensic accounting career. What he'd discovered in those next few hours of digital archaeology painted a picture so devastating that I found myself grateful Emma wasn't there to witness my reaction. The email thread stretched back 14 months, beginning just 2 weeks after Daniel and Emma's first date. The messages started innocuously enough, Daniel reaching out to apologize for how things ended between him and Lila. But they quickly evolved into something far more sinister. I need more time, read one message from Daniel, dated 3 months into his relationship with Emma. The trust fund situation is more complicated than I thought. She's not as naive as she appears. Lila's response had been devastating in its clarity. You promised me 6 months, Daniel. I can't keep pretending I don't exist while you play house with my best friend. But perhaps the most damning evidence came in the form of a spreadsheet attachment. A detailed financial analysis of my family's assets that Daniel had compiled with the precision of a forensic auditor. Property values, investment portfolios, the estimated worth of family heirlooms. Everything itemized and calculated down to the last dollar. He wasn't just dating her, Mom, Zach explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. He was conducting a financial audit disguised as a romance. The hotel receipts told their own story. Every business trip Daniel claimed to take, every weekend conference that kept him away from Emma, had been spent in hotel rooms across the city with Lila. The dates aligned perfectly with Daniel's absences, creating a timeline of deception that left me breathless. Most revealing was a cancelled jewelry appraisal from Tiffany & Company, dated just 1 week before Daniel proposed to Emma. The appointment had been for an engagement ring, but not the one currently sitting on my daughter's finger. This ring was being appraised for resale value, suggesting Daniel had originally purchased it for someone else entirely. When Zach reached out to Lila, her response had been immediate and devastating. She agreed to meet him at a small cafe downtown, away from any chance encounters with mutual acquaintances. Zach described her as a shadow of the vibrant girl I remembered, hollow-eyed and brittle, like someone carrying a secret too heavy for her frame. He told me Emma was just a rebound, Lila had confessed through tears. That he needed time to process our relationship but that she meant nothing. He said she was too sheltered, too dependent on her family's money to ever be truly independent. The cruelest revelation was that Lila had learned about the engagement the same way everyone else had, through Emma's social media announcement. No warning, no explanation, just the sudden, devastating realization that the man she'd been secretly seeing for over a year was marrying her former best friend. I wanted to call Emma so many times, Lila had told Zach. But what could I say? That I'd been sleeping with her fiancé? That everything she thought she knew about their relationship was a lie. But it was the unopened envelope that Zach found tucked between the printed emails that revealed Daniel's true intentions. Addressed to Lila in Daniel's distinctive handwriting, it contained a plane ticket to Barcelona and a hotel reservation, both dated for the day after the wedding. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note. Once I have access to the trust, we can disappear together. Emma will be devastated, but she'll recover. He always does. Pack light, we won't be coming back. The note was dated 2 weeks before Daniel's proposal, revealing a level of premeditation that made my stomach churn. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of weakness. It was a calculated heist disguised as a love story. Zach's voice broke as he read the note aloud over the phone. Mom, he's planning to take everything and run. The wedding isn't the ending, It's just the beginning of the real theft. I sat in my chair long after Zach finished talking, staring at the family photographs arranged on the mantelpiece. Emma's graduation picture smiled back at me, her arm linked with Lila's, both girls beaming with the confidence of young women who believed the world was full of endless possibilities. What do we do? I finally asked, though part of me already knew the answer. We don't tell her, Zach said firmly. Not yet. If we confront him now, he'll just disappear and we'll never be able to prove anything. But if we let him think he's won, we can catch him in the act, I finished. Exactly. But Mom, we need to move fast. The wedding is in 6 months, and once he has legal access to Emma's assets, he'll be gone before she realizes what happened. That night I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad, mapping out a strategy that would protect my daughter while ensuring Daniel faced the consequences of his deception. The moon cast long shadows across the pages as I worked, and with each line I wrote, I felt the familiar surge of protective fury that had carried me through Emma's childhood's scraped knees and teenage heartbreaks. But this was different. This wasn't a playground bully or a thoughtless teenage boy. This was a predator who had studied my family like a business acquisition, who had weaponized my daughter's capacity for love against her. By morning I had a plan. And by evening Zach and I had begun to implement it. The game had begun, but Daniel didn't know he was no longer the only player at the table. The next morning I called Richard Pemberton before my coffee had even finished brewing. Richard had been handling our family's legal affairs for 23 years, ever since my husband's passing, and I trusted him with secrets that could topple governments, or in this case, destroy a carefully constructed fraud. Margaret, it's barely 7 a.m., Richard's gravelly voice answered on the second ring. This must be serious. Richard, I need an emergency appointment. Today. And I need complete discretion. There was a pause, then the sound of papers rustling. How emergency are we talking? Scale of 1 to 10. 11. 2 hours later, I sat across from Richard's mahogany desk in his downtown office, watching his expression grow increasingly grim as I laid out everything Zach had discovered. The emails, the hotel receipts, the plane tickets. Each piece of evidence landed on his desk like a chess piece being positioned for checkmate. Good Lord, Margaret, he muttered, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. This isn't just fraud. It's systematic deception with clear intent to commit theft. Can we stop it legally? Richard leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. We can do better than stop it. We can create a trap so legally sound that even the best defense attorney couldn't find a crack. The first move was restructuring Emma's trust fund. What Daniel didn't know, what Emma herself didn't fully understand, was that her inheritance wasn't automatically accessible upon marriage. The original trust had been designed with protective clauses, but they weren't nearly robust enough to handle someone as calculating as Daniel. We're adding a 5-year marriage requirement, Richard explained as he pulled up the trust documents on his computer. No access to principal or significant distributions unless the marriage remains intact for a full 5 years. Any attempt to divorce or separate during that period triggers an automatic review of the beneficiary's intentions. I watched him type the new clauses, each word a nail in Daniel's coffin. What if he contests it? He can't contest what he doesn't know exists, Richard smiled grimly. This amendment is retroactive to last month, well before any engagement announcements. As far as the law is concerned, these protections were always in place. While Richard worked on the trust modifications, I reached out to Jennifer Walsh, our estate planning attorney. If Richard was a scalpel, Jennifer was a sledgehammer. Precise when needed, devastating when required. Margaret, darling, Jennifer's voice was warm but professional. Richard briefed me on the situation. I have to say, this is the most elaborate con I've encountered in 15 years of practice. Can you help us? Help you? Sweetheart, I'm going to gift wrap this man's downfall. The estate modification was elegant in its simplicity. Jennifer drafted an addendum to our family will that would automatically exclude any beneficiary who entered marriage under false pretenses. The language was carefully crafted to be ironclad yet invisible, buried in subsection 12 of a 30-page document that most people would never read completely. Any beneficiary who misrepresents their intent to marry for financial gain shall forfeit all claims to inheritance, gifts, or family assets, Jennifer read aloud as she finalized the document. It's beautiful, really. Completely legal, impossible to challenge, and retroactively applied to any marriages occurring within 12 months of this filing. But the most crucial element was the evidence gathering. Zach had become our secret weapon, using his forensic accounting skills to build an unshakable case. Every evening after work he would arrive at my house with new discoveries, each more damning than the last. "Lila's been incredibly helpful," he reported during one of our clandestine meetings. "She saved everything. Voice messages where Daniel explicitly talks about Emma's family money. Text conversations where he jokes about playing the long game. Even photos of documents he showed her, including a handwritten list of our family assets that he compiled while supposedly helping Emma organize her closet. The voice recordings were particularly devastating. In one message recorded just 3 weeks before the proposal, Daniel's voice dripped with calculated charm. "Baby, I know this is hard, but think about what we'll have once I secure the trust fund. We're talking generational wealth here. Emma's nice enough, but she's just a means to an end." Lila had also provided something even more valuable: Daniel's calendar entries from his phone, which he'd shared with her during their relationship. The entries revealed a disturbing pattern of strategic planning. "Coffee with ease, mom. Charm offensive," read one entry. Another noted, "Research family charity connections, potential networking opportunities." But perhaps most chilling was an entry from 2 months ago. "Convince E to add me to investment accounts. Marriage equals full access." He's been documenting his own crime, Zach marveled as he showed me the screenshots. "It's like he wanted to get caught." "Arrogance," I replied simply. "He thinks he's smarter than everyone else." The next phase required delicate timing. We needed to ensure Emma remained unaware of our activities while simultaneously protecting her from Daniel's manipulation. This meant maintaining normal family interactions while secretly dismantling his entire plan. I began subtly questioning Emma about their financial discussions during our weekly lunch dates. "Have you and Daniel talked about combining your accounts after the wedding?" I asked casually over Caesar salads at her favorite bistro. Emma's face brightened. "Actually, yes. He's been so sweet about it. He said he wants to handle all the complicated financial stuff so I don't have to worry about it." "Isn't that thoughtful?" My heart clenched, but I kept my expression neutral. "Very thoughtful. What kind of arrangement are you considering?" He suggested adding him to my investment accounts right after the honeymoon. Something about streamlining our financial planning. She paused, twirling pasta around her fork. He even offered to take over managing the trust fund distributions. Said I shouldn't burden myself with all those complicated documents. Every word confirmed our worst fears. Daniel wasn't just planning to access Emma's money. He was systematically positioning himself to control every aspect of her financial life. Meanwhile, Zach had enlisted Lila's help in gathering even more evidence. She agreed to meet Daniel one final time, wearing a recording device provided by Richard's private investigator. The conversation that resulted was so incriminating that even I was shocked by Daniel's callousness. "Once we're married, I'll have legal access to everything," Daniel's recorded voice explained to Lila. "The trust fund, the investment accounts, even her grandmother's jewelry collection. We just need to be patient for a few more months." "What about Emma?" Lila had asked. "Don't you feel guilty at all?" Daniel's laugh was cold and mechanical. "Guilty? She's getting what she wants. A wedding, a husband, the whole fairy tale. She'll survive the heartbreak. Rich girls always do." The recording device had captured every word with crystal clarity, providing us with evidence that would hold up in any court of law. As the wedding date approached, I found myself living a strange double life. During the day, I was the supportive mother of the bride, attending dress fittings and cake tastings with genuine enthusiasm for Emma's happiness. But in the evenings, I was a general planning a war, coordinating with attorneys and investigators to ensure Daniel's scheme would collapse the moment he tried to execute it. The most difficult part was watching Emma's excitement grow daily while knowing the truth about the man she was preparing to marry. She would call me with updates about their honeymoon plans, their apartment hunting, their dreams for the future. All built on foundations that would crumble within hours of saying "I do." But every time I was tempted to tell her everything, I remembered Richard's warning: if we tip our hand too early, Daniel will disappear. Better to let him hang himself with his own rope. 3 weeks before the wedding we filed all the documents. The trust modifications, the estate amendments, the evidence packages. Everything was legally secured and time-stamped. Daniel's trap was set, baited with the very greed that had driven him to target my daughter in the first place. That night, I stood on my terrace overlooking the garden where Emma would soon exchange vows with a man who saw her as nothing more than a financial opportunity. The irony wasn't lost on me. We were allowing the wedding to proceed precisely because we wanted to protect her. Sometimes love means watching someone walk into danger, knowing you've already cleared the path behind them. The wedding reception unfolded like a perfectly choreographed performance, each moment timed to create maximum emotional impact. As guests settled into their seats for dinner, Daniel stood at the head table, commanding attention with the natural confidence of someone who believed he'd already won the ultimate prize. The crystal champagne flute in his hand caught the light from the crystal chandeliers above, our family's baccarat stemware, reserved for only the most significant celebrations. Each piece was worth more than most people's monthly salary, and Daniel held his like a trophy he'd earned rather than a privilege he'd been granted. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice carried across the ballroom without need for amplification. The conversations died down, replaced by the expectant silence of guests preparing to witness what they assumed would be a heartfelt declaration of love. I watched from my position at the family table, my own champagne untouched as Daniel's smile widened. There was something predatory in his expression, the look of a hunter who'd successfully cornered his prey. When I first met Emma, he began, his free hand finding her shoulder possessively, I knew I'd found something rare. Something precious that needed proper care and guidance. The words made my stomach turn. Even in his wedding toast he couldn't help but position himself as Emma's superior, her protector, her guide. Around me, guests smiled benevolently, hearing romance where I heard condescension. To forever, Daniel raised his glass higher, the crystal singing a pure note as it caught the light. To building something beautiful together. To securing our future. The word, securing, hit me like a physical blow. Even now, surrounded by our family and friends, he couldn't resist a subtle reference to his true motivation. Cameras flashed like lightning as he leaned down to kiss Emma's cheek, his lips lingering just long enough to make the photographers happy. I lifted my own glass with trembling fingers, the smile I'd perfected over decades of society functions firmly in place. Around me, guests applauded and cheered, completely unaware that they were celebrating the beginning of an elaborate theft. But as Daniel basked in the applause, his eyes swept the room with the calculating gaze I'd learned to recognize. He was counting guests, mentally cataloging influential faces, already planning how to leverage these connections for future opportunities. Zach's empty chair at our family table seemed to grow more prominent as the evening progressed. It sat like a question mark in the midst of celebration, drawing curious glances and whispered speculations from guests who knew our family well enough to notice the absence. Mrs. Henderson from the country club leaned over during the second course. Margaret dear, where's Zach this evening? I was so looking forward to seeing him. Business travel, I replied smoothly, the lie now rehearsed to perfection. You know how demanding his work can be. But Daniel's explanation to his groomsmen had been different, more revealing of his character. I'd overheard him near the bar, gesturing dismissively toward the empty chair. Zach's got some issues with commitment, he'd said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Probably couldn't handle seeing his sister actually follow through with something important. The casual cruelty of the comment took my breath away. Here was my son who'd spent months protecting his sister from a predator, being dismissed as unreliable by the very man whose crimes he'd uncovered. As the evening wore on, Daniel's behavior became increasingly revealing to those who knew how to look. During the dinner service, I watched him charm the elderly widows at table 6, paying particular attention to Mrs. Ashford, whose late husband had left her a considerable art collection. You absolutely must show me your Monet sometime, Daniel was saying, his hand placed respectfully on her arm. I've been studying Impressionist investments lately. Fascinating market. Mrs. Ashford beamed under his attention, completely missing the way his eyes assessed her diamond tennis bracelet while he spoke about art appreciation. Later, while Emma freshened her makeup, I witnessed Daniel's conversation with my business partner's son, a recent Harvard MBA who managed several hedge funds. The Wellington family has such interesting investment strategies, Daniel mentioned casually. Emma's grandmother was particularly savvy with her portfolio choices. I'd love to learn more about the family's approach to wealth preservation. Each conversation was carefully orchestrated, each question designed to gather intelligence about our financial landscape. Daniel wasn't just celebrating his wedding, he was conducting reconnaissance for his future heist. But perhaps most disturbing was overhearing his phone call during a brief break between courses. He'd stepped onto the terrace, thinking himself alone, when his voice drifted through the French doors. "Everything's going perfectly," he said quietly into his phone. "The trust fund transfer should be accessible within the week." "Yes, I have the account numbers." "No, she suspects nothing." I pressed myself against the wall inside the ballroom, my heart pounding as I realized he was likely speaking to Lila, confirming their escape plans even as he celebrated his marriage to my daughter. When the band announced the mother-daughter dance, I felt the weight of the moment settle on my shoulders like a velvet cloak. This would be my last chance to prepare Emma for what was coming. Not the details, which would have been too devastating, but the emotional foundation she'd need to survive it. As "The Way You Look Tonight" began to play, Emma floated into my arms like she had as a little girl, back when her biggest problems could be solved with band-aids and bedtime stories. "You look radiant tonight, sweetheart," I whispered, meaning every word. Despite everything I knew about Daniel, despite the elaborate trap we'd set, Emma genuinely glowed with happiness. "I feel like I'm dreaming," she whispered back, her eyes bright with unshed tears of joy. We swayed together in comfortable silence for several measures before I felt compelled to plant the seed that might help her understand what was coming. "Emma," I said softly, pulling her closer so my words would reach only her ears. "No matter what happens in the coming days, remember that sometimes the people who love us most have to make difficult choices to protect us." She pulled back slightly, confusion clouding her features. "Mom, what do you mean?" "Just remember that love sometimes looks like letting go," I continued, my voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm me. "And sometimes, sweetheart, the absence of someone we expect to be there is the greatest gift they can give us." Emma's brow furrowed, but before she could ask more questions, the song was ending and Daniel was approaching to claim his dance with his new bride. As I returned to my seat, I caught Daniel watching me with narrowed eyes. For just a moment, his charming mask slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. He'd heard something in my tone, sensed some undercurrent he couldn't quite identify. But then Emma was in his arms, and his practiced smile returned as cameras captured their first dance as husband and wife. He spun her gracefully, dipped her dramatically for the photographers, and whispered something in her ear that made her laugh. I sat at the family table, fingering the stem of my crystal champagne flute, and watched the man who thought he'd just secured his fortune dance with my daughter. Tomorrow he would discover that some victories are hollow, that some prizes come with prices he'd never anticipated paying. The empty chair beside me seemed to pulse with invisible energy, a reminder that the most important battles are often fought by those who choose to remain unseen. As the last dance ended and guests began filtering toward the exit, Daniel caught my eye across the dance floor. He raised his crystal flute one final time in my direction, a gesture I recognized as both gratitude and triumph. I smiled and raised my own glass in return, knowing it would be the last toast we'd ever share. The first rays of dawn filtered through the curtains of the honeymoon suite at the Grand Marquis Hotel, casting golden streaks across rumpled Egyptian cotton sheets. Daniel stirred slowly, his arm reaching across the king-sized bed for the warmth of his new bride, only to find cold, empty space where Emma should have been. His eyes snapped open, immediately scanning the opulent room that had cost more per night than most people earned in a month. The silence was deafening. No shower running, no soft humming from the bathroom, no gentle rustling of silk pajamas that he'd grown accustomed to during their cohabitation. "Emma." His voice cracked slightly, still rough with sleep and champagne from the night before. "Nothing." Daniel sat up abruptly, his head spinning from the sudden movement and the remnants of celebration. The suite looked exactly as they'd left it the night before, champagne bottle chilling in its silver bucket, rose petals scattered across the marble floor, wedding dress hanging pristinely in the armoire like a white ghost. But Emma's overnight bag was gone. Her jewelry case, the one that contained her grandmother's pearl earrings and the sapphire bracelet he'd specifically suggested she bring, had vanished from the vanity table. Even her phone charger had been removed from the bedside table. The only trace of her presence was a single sheet of hotel stationery, folded precisely in half and placed on her pillow. Daniel's hands trembled slightly as he reached for it, some primal instinct already warning him that whatever was written there would change everything. The note was written in Emma's careful script, each letter formed with the precision she'd learned in those expensive private schools. Check your inbox. 3 words. 21 letters. The complete destruction of his carefully orchestrated plan. Daniel's laptop sat closed on the mahogany desk across the room, suddenly looking like a ticking bomb rather than the tool he'd used to research and catalog the Wellington family's assets. He approached it with the reluctance of a man walking to his own execution. The email notification showed 47 unread messages, but only one sender mattered. emma.wellington.daniel@gmail.com. The timestamp read 5:47 a.m., less than 6 hours after their last dance, while he'd been sleeping off the champagne and dreaming of Barcelona beaches. The subject line was devastatingly simple: everything I know. Daniel's finger hovered over the trackpad for several heartbeats before he found the courage to open what he somehow knew would be his professional and personal obituary. The email began without preamble or emotion, just cold, factual presentation of evidence that made his blood turn to ice water. Daniel. Attached you will find screenshots of every email you sent to Lila Martinez during our relationship. Voice recordings of your conversations about my family's financial opportunities. Copies of hotel receipts for nights you claimed to be traveling for work. The prenuptial agreement you drafted before proposing. And the plane tickets to Barcelona dated for today. Tickets purchased in both your name and Lila's. My brother found everything 6 months ago. We've been waiting. Daniel's vision blurred as he scrolled through attachment after attachment. Screenshots of messages he'd thought were private, recorded phone calls where his voice dripped with calculated greed, even photos of handwritten notes where he'd calculated the estimated value of various family heirlooms. But the final attachment was what destroyed him completely. A forwarded message from Lila Martinez, sent to Emma just hours earlier. Emma, I can't let this happen anymore. He told me you were just a means to an end, that once he had access to your trust fund, we would disappear together. I was weak and lonely and believed his lies about loving me. He played us both and I can't live with myself if I don't tell you the truth. I'm sorry for everything. Lila. Daniel stared at the screen, watching his future evaporate in real time. His phone buzzed with incoming notifications, text messages, missed calls, voicemails piling up as the reality of his situation began to cascade through his carefully constructed network. He grabbed his phone with shaking hands, scrolling through message after message of cancellations and reversals that felt like watching dominoes fall in slow motion. His travel agent. Mr. Harrison, your flights to Barcelona have been cancelled at the request of your credit card company. Please contact us immediately. His bank. Account number 4472 has been temporarily frozen pending investigation of suspicious activity. Please visit our fraud department immediately. The hotel concierge. Sir, we've been instructed to hold all charges to your account pending resolution of a legal matter. Your corporate rate has been revoked. Even his attorney had sent a terse message. Daniel, I've received some disturbing information about your recent activities. We need to meet immediately. Do not contact Emma Wellington or her family. The walls of the luxury suite seemed to close in around him as the magnitude of his situation became clear. Everything he'd planned, every move he'd calculated, every lie he'd carefully constructed had been anticipated and countered by people he'd underestimated completely. His phone rang, the name Mom Wellington, appearing on the screen like a death sentence. Daniel stared at it for several rings before desperation overcame his fear. Why? The word escaped his lips before he could stop it, raw and broken and nothing like the confident charm he'd wielded so effectively for months. Margaret Wellington's voice came through the speaker like winter wind, cold, cutting, final. There was a long pause, as if she were savoring the moment of his destruction. You toasted to forever last night, she said finally, her words measured and deliberate. But you forgot something important, Daniel. Some toasts end with broken glass. The line went dead, leaving him alone with the silence that felt heavier than any sound he'd ever heard. Minutes later, his laptop chimed with one final message. This one came from an email address he'd never seen before. Zachary.wellington.private@gmail.com. The message contained only a single sentence, but it cut deeper than Emma's evidence or Margaret's cold dismissal. You'll remember that empty chair forever. Because it was empty and still more useful than you. Daniel collapsed into the velvet armchair beside the window, staring out at the city skyline that had looked so promising just hours earlier. Somewhere out there, Emma was safe with her family, probably being comforted by the brother whose absence had seemed like such a minor detail the night before. The empty chair. The missing piece that he'd dismissed as unimportant, never realizing it represented the very person who'd been documenting his every move, building the case that would destroy him. As the morning sun climbed higher, Daniel sat in his empty suite, surrounded by the remnants of a celebration that had actually been his funeral. The champagne had gone flat, the roses were wilting, and the future he'd so carefully planned had crumbled to dust while he slept. The silence stretched endlessly before him, broken only by the distant sound of traffic and the steady buzz of his phone, call after call from numbers he didn't recognize, probably reporters or investigators or angry family members who'd just learned the truth. He didn't answer any of them. What was the point? The game was over and he'd lost more completely than he'd ever imagined possible. The empty chair had won. 3 weeks after the wedding that wasn't really a wedding, Emma appeared at my kitchen door holding nothing but her car keys and a small overnight bag. The morning light caught the hollow spaces beneath her eyes, but there was something different about her posture. Straighter, more deliberate, like she'd shed an invisible weight I hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. "Can I come home?" she asked, her voice steady despite the vulnerability in the question. I opened my arms without hesitation, and for the first time in months, my daughter's embrace felt genuine. No performance, no desperate attempt to convince herself she was happy. Just Emma returning to herself. Over the following days, I watched her navigate the quiet spaces of our house with a grace I hadn't seen since before Daniel entered her life. She would sit in the garden with her morning coffee, reading books she'd abandoned during their relationship. She cooked elaborate meals for just the two of us, humming softly while she worked. A habit Daniel had criticized as too distracting. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. It was subtle, like watching a flower unfold in slow motion. She laughed more freely, but the laughter was quieter, more genuine. Her smiles became smaller but somehow more radiant, reaching her eyes in a way they hadn't for months. One evening, about 2 weeks after her return, Emma made dinner. Her grandmother's recipe for coq au vin, the one that required hours of patient preparation. We ate by candlelight in the dining room, using the good china, sharing comfortable silences between bites. "Thank you," she said suddenly, setting down her wine glass with deliberate care. I waited, knowing she needed space to find her words. "I know you knew," she continued, her eyes meeting mine across the table. "Maybe not everything, but enough. And I know you could have stopped it earlier, but you didn't. You let me have my wedding day even knowing." She trailed off, but her expression held no anger, only a deep, complicated gratitude that didn't require explanation. "You deserve to make your own choice," I replied simply. "Even if that choice was discovering the truth for yourself." We finished dinner without mentioning Daniel's name once, and somehow that silence felt more healing than any conversation could have been. Zach's return happened gradually, like sunrise after a long night. Emma had been home for almost a month when she finally asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Where is he really?" "Zach, I know he wasn't traveling for work." We were sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose. Emma's voice held curiosity rather than accusation, as if she were solving a puzzle rather than confronting a deception. "Why don't you call him and ask?" I suggested gently. She pulled out her phone and dialed his number. I could hear it ringing through the speaker, then Zach's familiar voice answering with cautious warmth. "Hey Em. Where are you?" she asked without preamble. "About 15 minutes away," he replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Been staying at the Marriott downtown. Waiting for you to be ready to see me." The tears came then, not the broken sobs of heartbreak, but the cleansing rain of relief and recognition. Zach arrived 20 minutes later, and Emma launched herself into his arms like she had when they were children and he'd returned from summer camp. "Not far," he said when she asked again where he'd been. "Just quiet." They held each other in the foyer for a long time, and when they finally separated, something in our family constellation had realigned itself. The empty space that Daniel had tried to fill was revealed for what it truly was. Not a void that needed filling, but a protective buffer that had kept us safe. The package from Lila arrived on a Thursday morning, wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside, nestled in tissue paper like a sacred relic, was the engagement ring Daniel had originally purchased for her. The one Zach had found documentation for during his investigation. It was beautiful in a conventional way. A classic solitaire setting with a diamond that caught the light predictably. But holding it, I felt only sadness for the woman who'd been manipulated just as thoroughly as my daughter, though in different ways. There was no note, no explanation, just the quiet gesture of a woman returning something that had never truly belonged to her. Emma examined the ring with detached curiosity, like an archaeologist studying an artifact from a civilization she'd never known. She loved him too, Emma said quietly, turning the ring in the morning light. Or thought she did. Yes, I agreed. You both deserved better. Emma placed the ring back in its box with gentle finality. What should we do with it? Whatever feels right to you. She was quiet for a moment, then smiled. One of those new, smaller smiles that held more truth than her old theatrical ones. I think I'll donate it. Let it become someone else's beginning instead of our ending. The society pages and gossip networks had a field day with the story, though they never learned the full truth. The official narrative was simply that the marriage had been annulled due to irreconcilable differences discovered immediately after the ceremony. But those who'd been at the wedding remembered the empty chair, and gradually, the real story emerged in whispered conversations at country clubs and charity galas. Remember the missing brother at the Wellington wedding? I overheard Mrs. Henderson saying at the club's spring luncheon. Turns out he saved the whole family from disaster. The conversations were always respectful, tinged with admiration rather than scandal. People began to understand that Zach's absence had been strategic, protective, even heroic. When they saw me now, there were subtle nods of acknowledgement, as if they recognized that I'd seen something they'd missed. The baccarat crystal flute that Daniel had toasted with that night found its way to a place of honor in my china cabinet. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder that sometimes the most precious things survive intact despite being handled by unworthy hands. These days, I keep that chair by the window in my study, positioned where the afternoon light falls across its empty seat. It's become my favorite piece of furniture, not despite its emptiness but because of it. Every morning, I dust it carefully, polish the wood until it gleams, and appreciate the space it occupies without demanding to be filled. Sometimes, when the light hits it just right, I can almost see Zach sitting there during those months of careful watching and patient planning. Other times, I see all the other meaningful absences in my life. My husband's chair at the dinner table, the space where Emma's childhood bedroom used to echo with laughter, the moments when saying nothing meant everything. The chair has taught me that absence isn't always loss. Sometimes it's protection. Sometimes it's strategy. Sometimes it's the deepest form of love, stepping back so others can learn to stand on their own, creating space for truth to emerge naturally rather than forcing revelations that might cause more harm than healing. Emma visits that chair sometimes, running her fingers along its wooden arms with the same reverence she once reserved for prayer. She understands now what it represents. Not abandonment but vigilance. Not distance, but the perfect positioning to catch someone when they're ready to fall into their own wisdom. Zach. He sits in it occasionally when he visits, usually when he's helping me plan some new family protection strategy or reviewing investment portfolios. The chair seems to fit him perfectly, as if it had been waiting all along for someone who understood that the most powerful position isn't always center stage. The empty chair has become our family's most treasured heirloom, not because of what it holds but because of what it protects. In its deliberate absence, we found our way back to each other. If this story of a mother's strategic protection had you captivated, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when the empty chair's true meaning was finally revealed, showing how absence became the ultimate act of love. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful family stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.